I didn't even look at her face. The man in the tailored charcoal suit, the one whose watch probably cost more than her motorcycle, turned to the room of executives and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Get her out. We don't need the help of someone like that in here." Someone like that. She was standing right there, still holding the food bags, still in her delivery jacket with the grease stain near the left pocket she'd never been able to scrub out. And every person in that conference room, 9 countries, billions of dollars on the table, professional translators, nowhere to be found, turned to look at her like she was something that had wandered in off the street. That was the moment Zuri Adebayo made a decision that would either destroy what little she had left or change everything. And she almost chose silence. She almost walked away. Almost. If this story already has you feeling something, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss stories like this one. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. The morning Zuri Adebayo's life cracked open like old pavement after a hard rain, she was running exactly 11 minutes late, and she already knew it was going to cost her. Not her job. She'd survived worse than 11 minutes. But the dispatcher at Quick Star Delivery had a habit of logging complaints that technically didn't exist, and Zuri had been warned twice in the past month that one more flag on her account could mean reassignment to the night shift. Night shift meant no school run coordination with her aunt back in Harare. Night shift meant her younger sister's medication paperwork, which required her to be on the phone between 9 and noon Korean time, would go unsigned for another week. So she drove fast. Not reckless. She hadn't been reckless in years, but fast. Seoul moved around her the way it always did. Indifferent, massive, brilliant in its organized chaos. She'd been here 4 years now, long enough to stop feeling like a tourist, but not long enough to stop noticing how certain doormen tensed when she walked toward their buildings. Long enough to have found 2 grocery stores where the owners didn't follow her between the shelves. She pulled her motorcycle to the service entrance of the Grand Lotus Hotel at 11:47, checked the order 3 times the way she always did. Because one wrong delivery could cascade into a complaint, a flag, a call she couldn't afford to miss, and hoisted both insulated bags onto her shoulders. The Grand Lotus was the kind of hotel that felt like a warning. Marble floors that reflected your own face back at you, slightly distorted. Chandeliers that probably hadn't been dusted since the current government took office. Staff who smiled at guests and looked straight through delivery personnel like they were made of something slightly transparent. She knew the route. Service elevator to the 3rd floor, turn left past the linen carts, follow the corridor until the smell of carpet cleaner gave way to something more expensive, then left again toward the executive conference suites. She had made this run before. Different orders, different days, same invisible path. What she hadn't made before was the mistake of arriving when conference room 3C was running 40 degrees hotter than anyone had planned. She heard it before she saw anything. Voices, not arguing exactly, but strained. The particular frequency of people who are trying to remain professional while something underneath the professionalism is beginning to buckle. She recognized that frequency. She'd grown up around it. Her father had that sound in his voice the year the harvest failed and he spent 3 months on the phone with creditors pretending that everything was fine. Zuri slowed her pace. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She genuinely wasn't. But the conference room door was not fully latched. Someone had stepped out recently and hadn't pulled it closed. And in the space between the door and the frame, words were leaking out in at least 4 languages simultaneously. She understood all of them. That was the thing nobody ever expected about Zuri Adebayo. When they looked at her, the size of her, the deep brown of her skin, the jacket with the Quick Star logo on the back, the helmet still leaving a faint ring in her hair, they constructed a complete story without asking her a single question. That story didn't include languages. It didn't include the 7 years she had spent reading linguistics textbooks the way other people read entertainment. It didn't include the fact that she had once been 6 months from completing a graduate degree at one of the continent's better universities. Before the phone call came, that changed the geometry of her life entirely. The story they told about her had exactly 1 chapter, delivery rider, full stop. She stood outside that door for what she would later estimate was about 45 seconds. Long enough to understand what was happening inside. Long enough to recognize that it was unraveling faster than the people in that room realized. The situation was this. Somewhere between Nairobi and Seoul, Between the initial proposal and the conference table, the professional interpretation team had failed to arrive. Flight delayed, then canceled, then rerouted. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that 9 delegations representing interests across 3 continents were seated around a table with documents they had come a very long way to sign, and the language between them had begun to collapse. A Kenyan delegate was explaining, in English, that a specific shipping clause was non-negotiable because of port regulations that had changed in March. The Korean executive, she could tell he was the lead from the way others deferred slightly in his direction, was responding in Korean to his team, and what she heard him say was not what the delegate meant, because the young associate who was attempting to interpret was good, but not good enough. He was translating the words correctly. He was losing the meaning entirely. Across the table, a French delegate from the European branch was growing visibly tighter in the jaw. He had just received a translation suggesting that the African partners had accused the Korean firm of deliberately misrepresenting their shipping timeline. That was not what had been said. What had been said was that the timeline contained a date that, under a particular regional calendar system used in some documentation, was ambiguous by exactly 30 days, and that ambiguity needed to be addressed before signatures were collected. 30 days. In a billion-dollar logistics agreement, 30 days is not a rounding error. It is a catastrophe waiting to wear business clothes. Zuri set the food bags down quietly against the wall. She should have kept walking. She had learned, the hard way, over years that left marks she didn't always show, that getting involved in things that didn't require your involvement was a fast path to consequences that wouldn't affect anyone else at the table. She had learned to let things go. She had learned to measure the distance between her problem and other people's problems and stay on her side of that line. She had been very good at that for a very long time. Her hand was on the door before she'd consciously decided to push it. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone walks in who was not expected. Not silent. There were still the sounds of papers and shifting chairs, but the quality of the sound changed. 17 people turned to look at her. She felt what she always felt in those moments, the slight tightening in her chest, the awareness of exactly how much space she took up, and how that registered on faces, and how some faces didn't bother to hide what they thought that meant about her. She spoke before doubt could pull her back out the door. "Excuse me." Her English was crisp, unhurried. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the timeline clause." The silence deepened. Then the man in the charcoal suit, seated to the right of the lead Korean executive, someone's deputy or advisor, the exact species of person who inherits a title and mistakes it for intelligence, looked at her the way certain people look at things that have appeared somewhere they don't belong. "Get her out," he said. Not quietly, not even pretending to be polite. "We don't need the help of someone like that in here." Someone like that. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. A few people looked away. One of the African delegates, a woman in a navy suit who would later become important to this story, looked directly at the man in charcoal with an expression that was cooler than the air conditioning. Zuri didn't move. This was the part that even she didn't fully understand afterward, when she tried to reconstruct the sequence of decisions that had led her to this particular minute. She was not a confrontational person. She had not been confrontational in years. Confrontation cost things she couldn't afford to spend. She had a family. She had a delivery record. She had 2 more runs after this one and a check she needed to clear before the 15th. But there is a particular kind of statement, the kind that doesn't just dismiss you, but dismisses the idea of you, the entire premise that you might be worth addressing. And something in Zuri had been absorbing those statements for long enough that her body had apparently reached its own conclusion separate from any rational calculation. She looked at the man in the charcoal suit, just looked at him. Then she turned to the room and said, in French, to the French delegate, whose jaw was still tight, "The African partners did not accuse anyone of misrepresentation. The concern was about an ambiguity in the calendar notation on page 41 of the draft. A date written as 0315 is being read 2 different ways, and the difference is 30 days. The French delegate blinked. She turned to the Kenyan delegate and said, in Swahili, that the Korean team had heard something different from what had been said, and that the misunderstanding was in the interpretation, not in the intention. She said this in Swahili so clean and natural that the delegate's expression changed in the way expressions change when someone speaks your language from inside it, not from a textbook at the surface. Then she turned to the Korean lead executive and said it again, in Korean. The clause, the calendar, the 30 days. What each side had meant, what each side had heard, the specific place in the document where the confusion had started. By the time she finished, no one in the room was looking at her the way they had been 30 seconds ago, except the man in the charcoal suit, who was now looking at her the way people look when they realize they have publicly stepped on something they cannot take back. The Korean lead, his name was Park Jun-seo, though she didn't know it yet, had very still eyes, the kind of stillness that isn't emptiness but control. He'd been watching her since the moment she walked in. He watched her now with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual because reading expressions was one of the things she'd been doing unconsciously her entire life. "Where did you learn Korean?" he asked. "In Korean." "Books," she said, "and 3 years of working in a neighborhood where nobody else spoke Shona." A pause. "Also, I've been making deliveries to this hotel for 8 months, and there's a lot of time to listen in service corridors." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, something quieter. "Sit down," he said. "I have 2 more deliveries," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll compensate you for the missed runs. Please sit down." She thought about the flag on her account. She thought about the medication paperwork. She thought about the way the man in charcoal had said someone like that, and the way the room had absorbed it like it was normal weather. She sat down. What followed in the next 2 hours was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said clearly what she'd expected. She had thought she might clarify 1 or 2 things and find an exit. Instead, she found herself in the deep current of something she hadn't navigated in years. Because translation, real translation, the kind that actually keeps rooms from collapsing, is not about language. Language is the smallest part of it. The real work is understanding why a person from one context uses a particular word and what that word carries that doesn't exist in the language you're translating into. It's understanding that a statement which sounds like stubbornness in one cultural frame is actually a form of respect in another. It's knowing when raised voices mean the conversation is failing and when they mean the conversation is finally, actually happening. These were things Zuri had known since she was 9 years old, growing up in a house where her grandmother spoke Ndebele, her father spoke Shona, her mother had grown up in Francophone-influenced border towns, and slipped between French and English depending on her mood, and where the neighbors spoke a mix of Chua and regional dialects that her father always called the real English of this continent. She had not valued this knowledge for a long time. It was not the kind of knowledge that appeared on resumes that got answered. It was not the kind of knowledge that the dispatcher at Quickstar factored into her performance rating. In conference room 3C of the Grand Lotus Hotel, with the food she'd delivered going cold in the hallway, it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. She navigated a disagreement between the French delegate and the East African consortium that had been quietly poisoning the room for 40 minutes before she walked in. The disagreement was not about money. It was about a phrase in the original proposal, regional implementation flexibility, that the European side had meant as a procedural term and the African partners had read as a precedent for unequal standards. Both sides were correct. Neither side had realized they were arguing about the same concern from opposite ends. She translated this not just in words, but in framing. She found the sentence in the document and read it aloud in 3 languages, then explained briefly how the ambiguity had entered at the drafting stage and had nothing to do with either party's intent. 3 things happened. The tension in the French delegate's shoulders dropped by about 40%. The lead of the East African Consortium, a man named Dr. Mensah, whose eyebrows had been at approximately forehead level for most of the morning, let out a breath through his nose and said quietly, "That's what I've been trying to say for 2 hours." And the man in the charcoal suit said nothing. He was not unimportant, this man. His name was Kwon Tae-yang, and he was the cousin of the company's 3rd largest investor, a fact that was apparently sufficient qualification for his presence at the table. He had spent the morning performing competence in the way people perform competence when they've never had to prove it, loudly, with many references to relationships and precedents, and very little engagement with the actual material. When Zuri had walked in, he had seen what he saw, a large black woman in a delivery jacket who had wandered into the wrong room. When she finished clarifying the 3rd misunderstanding in 90 minutes, he was still looking at her, but the texture of the look had changed into something she recognized from a different category of experience. Not dismissal now, something closer to its opposite and angrier for it. She didn't have time to think about him. There was still work, the summit, and that was what it was, though she hadn't known it when she knocked on the door, had 3 more agenda items. Each one had a buried translation problem. The shipping clause that had started everything. An indemnity paragraph that used a legal term with no precise equivalent in 2 of the working languages. A verbal agreement about implementation timelines that 3 different parties had understood 3 different ways. One by one, she worked through them, not perfectly. She stumbled on a term of art from a specific sector of Korean commercial law and had to ask for clarification. She mispronounced a Swahili name and corrected herself. She was aware continuously of the slight soreness in her lower back from 3 hours of delivery riding and of the food bags in the corridor and of the fact that she was still wearing the jacket with the Quickstar logo on it. She was not composed because she felt composed. She was composed because she had learned, the hard way, that composure was not a feeling. It was a decision you remade every few seconds. When the 2 hours ended, Park Jun-seo called a recess at precisely 2:15. 3 of the 4 major points had moved from stalled to agreed. The room had the distinct quality of air after a storm has passed, before anyone is quite sure what the ground looks like. The woman in navy, the East African delegate she hadn't yet spoken to directly, whose name was Dr. Fatima Osei, stopped her near the door. "You have a gift," Dr. Osei said. Not as a compliment exactly, as an assessment. The way a person who knows what things are worth states what they see. Zuri wanted to say something modest and deflecting. That was her practiced response to any recognition. She had been deflecting recognition since she was 12. Instead, she said, "I just know how to listen." Dr. Osei looked at her for a moment. "That," she said, "is the rarest thing in any room." She stepped aside to let Zuri pass, and Zuri walked back into the corridor and picked up the food bags. Cold now, definitely cold, and she was going to hear about it, and stood for a moment just outside the service elevator door. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. Her mind was not. In the space behind her eyes, something was moving that hadn't moved in years. She didn't know what to call it yet. She'd been careful not to name things she wasn't sure she could afford to want. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. She had 2 more deliveries, a back that ached, a jacket that smelled like insulation foam and exhaust, and exactly 11 minutes before her next scheduled drop. She was already late. She didn't care, for the first time in longer than she could remember, even a little bit. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor and Zuri walked out into the service corridor with both food bags, her helmet tucked under her arm, and the specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical work, but from being absolutely present in a room where you also had to be invisible. She got exactly 9 steps before her phone rang. It was the dispatcher. His name was Mr. Cho, and he communicated in 3 tonal registers: irritated, more irritated, and the particular flat affect he reserved for conversations where he'd already made a decision and was informing you rather than discussing. Adebayo. 2 missed drop confirmations. Client at the Sinsadong address is calling the main line. "I was detained upstairs," she said. "The food is still sealed. I'm delivering now." Detained. He said the word like he was tasting something questionable. By who? She considered the answer. Conference meeting needed language support. "I was asked to stay." A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. "You're a delivery rider, Adebayo, not a conference interpreter." "I know what I am," she said. "I'm also still holding their food." He hung up. That was, in her experience, either a good sign or a very bad one, and there was no way to know which until the next scheduled email arrived. She delivered the cold food. She apologized to the Sinsadong client, a law firm receptionist who accepted the apology with the efficiency of someone who had more important problems. She logged the delay herself, which was against nothing in the company manual, but against the unofficial culture of never documenting your own mistakes. Then she sat on her motorcycle outside the law firm for 4 minutes and did not start the engine. She was thinking about a room, about the way Dr. Mensah had exhaled when she'd explained the clause, about the way Park Jun-seo had watched her with those very still eyes, about Kwon Tae-young and the expression that had moved through his face like weather, dismissal to surprise to something that had hardened at its edges. She started the engine and drove back into the city. Park Jun-seo called at 6:47 that evening. She was eating rice at her kitchen table, reviewing a vocabulary list she kept for a Amharic extension course she was working through on her phone. And the incoming number was one she didn't recognize, which meant she almost didn't answer. Ms. Adebayo. His Korean was deliberate, unhurried. I hope I'm not interrupting something important. I'm eating, she said, which was honest, and she immediately realized probably not the tone she should have opened with. Then I'll be brief. I'd like to offer you a consulting arrangement. 2 days next week, possibly extending further, depending on how the summit stage develops. The compensation would be, he named a figure. She put her chopsticks down. The figure he named was equivalent to approximately 6 weeks of delivery income. For 2 days. That's not a consulting fee, she said. That's a... She stopped. Recalibrated. Why? Because what happened in that room this afternoon would have cost my company 3 times that amount in collapse negotiations, if you hadn't walked through the door. A pause. Not awkward, considered. And because Kwan Taeyang spent 40 minutes after the recess telling me the whole thing was a fluke. The silence on her end lasted long enough that he added, his objection was itself informative. She understood what he was saying without him saying it. That Taeyang's hostility was data, that someone who reacted to her ability with that much immediate anger had a specific kind of investment in her not being capable. I have a delivery job, she said. I know. I can't just... I have commitments, financial commitments that depend on consistent income. 2 days doesn't change that. The arrangement can be structured however you need it structured, he said. I'm not trying to take something from you, Ms. Adebayo. I'm trying to offer you something. She stood up from the table and walked to the window. Her apartment was on the 5th floor of a building that was not quite nice and not quite falling apart, which was a fair description of most things in her life at that moment. The street below had the quiet, purposeful movement of a sole evening. I need to think about it, she said. Of course. Another pause. I should tell you, the summit reconvenes Thursday. Whether or not you take the consulting arrangement, I'd like you to be in the room. We haven't confirmed a replacement interpretation team, and the remaining agenda items are the most sensitive. That's not fair, she said. No, he agreed, without any apparent discomfort. It isn't. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. I'll call you tomorrow, she said, and ended the call. She stood at the window for a long time after that. The rice went cold. She didn't eat it. She called her sister that night. Tendai was 23 and had been dealing with a kidney condition that required medication that cost, in the Zimbabwean context, an amount that was technically affordable and practically impossible. The treatment wasn't experimental. It wasn't rare. It was just expensive in the specific way that things become expensive when the infrastructure for making them affordable doesn't exist where you happen to have been born. How was your day? Tendai asked. Her voice had the particular brightness she put on for these calls, the one that Zuri recognized as effort, as love, as the careful work of not making her older sister worry more than she already did. Interesting, Zuri said. Someone offered me a job. A real job? Consulting, 2 days. Is it legitimate? He's an executive at a major Korean logistics firm. She paused. He seems to be. Tendai was quiet for a moment. How much? Zuri told her. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It had weight. Zuri, her sister said. I know. For 2 days. I know. What's the catch? That's what I've been sitting here trying to figure out, she said. And that was honest. Because in her experience, things that looked like opportunities had a complicated relationship with the word opportunity. The last time she had trusted that relationship, she had ended up in a graduate program she had to leave 18 months before completion, with student debt that still had 7 years on its repayment schedule and a credential she couldn't finish and couldn't use. She didn't say any of that to Tendai. Tendai knew it. They didn't need to say things they both knew. Your gut, Tendai said. What does it say? Zuri looked at the darkened window. My gut hasn't been reliable lately. I told you to go into that room today. A beat. How did you know about the room? You wouldn't have mentioned a job offer unless something had already happened, Tendai said. You hate talking about yourself, so something happened, Zuri told her. Not everything. Not the way Taeyang's words had landed, not the specific quality of Park Junseo's silence when she'd corrected the third misunderstanding, but enough. The collapsed interpretations, the calendar clause. Doctor, Mensa's exhale. Dr. Osi's words at the door. When she finished, Tendai was quiet for a long time. Call him back tonight, her sister said finally. You said I should think about it. I know what I said. Call him back tonight before you think yourself out of it. She didn't call that night, but she also didn't sleep. Thursday arrived with the speed that unwanted things tend to arrive, which is to say, faster than seemed reasonable. Zuri showed up at this Grand Lotus at 8:45 in clean clothes, not her delivery jacket, which was the best statement she could make about the fact that this was different, and was met in the lobby by a young woman named Shin Yejin, who was Park Jun-seo's assistant, and who had the brisk, precisely calibrated energy of someone who managed 17 things before 9 in the morning and considered this a reasonable pace. Mr. Park wanted to brief you before the session starts, Yejin said, already moving. About what specifically? The structure of today's agenda and… Yejin paused with the tiny hesitation of someone deciding how much to say. Some personnel considerations. Personnel considerations. Zuri filed that phrase next to the memory of Kwon Tae-young's face. The briefing room was smaller than conference room 3C. Park Jun-seo was already there with two other people she hadn't met, a woman introduced as Director Han Mirai, head of international partnerships, and a man named Baek Sung-ho, legal counsel. They both looked at Zuri with the specific brand of neutral that takes training to maintain. Thank you for coming, Park said. I want to be transparent with you about today's situation before we go in. Please, she said. Kwon Tae-young will not be in the room today. He's been reassigned to a different working group for the duration of the summit. He said it clean, no emotion on it. However, the reason I'm telling you is that his absence will be noticed, and some of the people in that room have existing relationships with him. You may feel that. Zuri looked at him. Feel it how? Testing. Skepticism directed at your translations. Requests for verification from people who, 2 days ago, weren't in a position to verify anything. Someone's going to try to catch me making a mistake, she said. Someone will try, yes. She sat with that for a moment. Director Han was watching her with an expression that was neutral, in the way a very controlled person's face is neutral when they've formed an opinion but haven't yet decided whether to share it. What's your assessment of my ability? Zuri asked her directly. Han Mirai blinked. It was a small thing, barely visible, but Zuri had spent years reading small things. I think you were effective on Tuesday, Han said carefully. I think today will tell us more. That's honest, Zuri said. I appreciate that. Something in Han's expression shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but less armored. The session began at 9:30. The agenda had 3 major items. The first was a follow-up on Tuesday's resolved clause, which should have been administrative but immediately became something else, when a delegate from one of the European subgroups, a man Zuri hadn't seen Tuesday, compact and precise in the way of someone who prepares aggressively for rooms he enters, raised a procedural objection in rapid regional French that was specifically designed to be difficult. She caught it, caught all of it, including the deliberate speed and the 2 vocabulary choices that were plausibly deniable as normal, but were in fact constructed to obscure. She translated it cleanly, then added, the delegate's concern is about procedural validity, specifically whether Tuesday's verbal agreements can be incorporated into the draft without a formal addendum process. The delegate looked at her. That's a liberal interpretation of what I said. It's an accurate one, she said, in French, meeting his eyes. The room's temperature shifted. Park Jun-seo said nothing. He was watching, the way he always seemed to be watching, with those still eyes that processed things at a speed that didn't show on his face. Dr. Mensa leaned forward slightly. Is the delegate suggesting Tuesday's session was procedurally invalid? I'm suggesting, the French delegate said more carefully now, that we follow process. Process was followed, Zuri said. I can outline the specific procedural steps if that would be helpful. There was a moment, one of those moments where a room can go in 2 directions, and then the French delegate leaned back slightly. That won't be necessary. Mini-crisis resolved. Round 1. The second agenda item was where it got harder. The item concerned indemnity language, specifically a clause about liability allocation in the event of supply disruption. The Korean legal team had drafted it in Korean and English. The English version had been translated into French by a firm in Paris, and into Swahili by a different firm in Nairobi, and the two resulting translations had a fundamental divergence on a single phrase that meant either the responsible party bears costs within the scope of contractual obligation, or the responsible party bears costs regardless of contractual scope. That divergence was not small. In a logistics agreement of this size, those two readings were separated by potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in exposure. Zuri identified it in the first 5 minutes of discussion. She did not say anything immediately. She was listening to the Swahili delegation's lead counsel, who was building an argument on the basis of the second reading, and to the French delegation's financial officer, who was operating on the basis of the first, and to the Korean legal team, who had written the original and had, as far as she could tell, meant something closer to the first, but whose Korean phrasing was actually ambiguous enough to support both. She was also watching Baek Sung-ho, the Korean legal counsel, who had gone very still in a different way than Park Jun-seo went still. This was the stillness of someone who had just seen a problem and was doing rapid calculations about what to do with that information. She caught his eye. He looked away. That was its own kind of information. The argument at the table sharpened. The Swahili delegation's lead counsel, a very sharp woman named Advocate Wanjiku, who had clearly been working in multilingual legal spaces for years, and had an instinct for the exact moment a conversation was about to cost someone money, said something in English that was technically precise and deliberately loaded. "We need to be certain that what was agreed in principle is what's actually on paper," she said, "because what's on paper, in the version we received, is not what we understood to be agreed." The French financial officer straightened. "We received the same document. You received a different translation. From the same source, different firms, different cities, and apparently different fundamental readings of a liability clause," Advocate Wanjiku said, and her voice was entirely controlled, which was exactly what made it devastating. Baek Sung-ho cleared his throat. "The Korean original is the binding document." "Then we need the Korean original accurately translated," Wanjiku said, "by someone in this room, now." Every person at that table turned toward Zuri. She had been hoping this moment wouldn't come quite this directly, quite this soon. She was good. She knew she was good. But Korean commercial law had specific terminology that overlapped with general language in ways that could create problems even for fluent speakers. And she had flagged this to herself on Tuesday, when Baek had mentioned the indemnity clause in passing. She looked at the original Korean text that Baek's associate had just placed in front of her. She read it twice. She read the specific phrase 3 times. She understood why it was ambiguous. The clause used a term, kagimbyomi neeso, that in common, Korean meant within the scope of responsibility, but in older commercial contract language, specifically in agreements modeled on a treaty framework from the 1990s, carried an extended meaning that included foreseeable third-party costs. If this document was using that older framework, which the structure of the surrounding clauses suggested it might be, then the Swahili reading was closer to the original intent than the French one. But she wasn't certain, and she knew better than to perform certainty she didn't have. "This phrase," she said, and her voice was steady, which was a choice, "has 2 legitimate readings depending on which drafting framework was used. Before I translate it, I need Mr. Baek to confirm whether this document was drafted using the 1997 bilateral framework or the standard UNIS commercial template." Silence. Baek Sung-ho's expression did not change, but his hand, resting on the table, shifted slightly. "The document was drafted using our standard internal template," he said, "which is based on which framework?" A pause that was a half-second too long. "The UNIS standard." "Then the correct reading," Zuri said, turning to the table, "is the more limited liability scope, costs within the contractual boundary." Advocate Wanjiku's eyes didn't leave Baek Sung-ho's face. "You're certain of that, Mr. Baek?" "I am," he said. Wanjiku looked at Zuri. "And you're satisfied with that answer?" Zuri held the advocate's gaze. "I'm satisfied with the translation. Whether the drafting choice itself reflected what was agreed in principle is a question for the parties, not for me." It was a careful sentence. She knew it was careful. Wanjiku knew it was careful. They looked at each other for a moment with the specific mutual recognition of 2 people who both understand exactly what is being said and what is being left unsaid. "We'll want that confirmed in writing before the end of day," Wanjiku said, turning to Baek. "Of course," Bayek said smoothly. The session broke for lunch at 12:30. Zuri sat in the briefing room alone, eating from a container of food she'd brought herself, going over the morning in her head with the particular scrutiny she applied to situations where she suspected she'd navigated something correctly, but wasn't entirely sure. The door opened and Director Han Mirai came in. She sat down across the table, which Zuri hadn't expected. "You handled the liability clause carefully," Han said. "I handled it honestly," Zuri said. "Whether that's the same as carefully, I'm not sure." Han looked at her, really looked, for the first time without the controlled neutrality in front of it. "What do you mean?" "Beck's answer to my question about the framework was the right answer for the room," Zuri said. "I'm not certain it was accurate." A beat. "You think the document might have been drafted on the older framework?" "I think there are clauses in that document that look like the older framework, which would mean the Swahili delegation's reading is correct, and the liability scope is broader than what just got confirmed at that table." Han was quiet for a long moment. Outside the briefing room, the corridor sounds of the hotel moved past like weather. "Why didn't you push harder?" Han asked. "Because I'm not a lawyer," Zuri said, "and because I wasn't certain. And because raising that in the room without certainty would have done more damage than waiting. And if Beck is covering a drafting error, then it'll surface," Zuri said. "These things always do, just usually at the worst possible time." Han looked at her for a long moment. Something was working behind those composed features, something that wasn't hostile but wasn't comfortable either. "How long have you been doing this?" Han asked. "Delivering food?" Zuri said. The edge in her voice was small. She didn't try to remove it. Han didn't flinch. "Working in multilingual professional environments. I did 4 years of graduate coursework in applied linguistics and cross-cultural negotiation. I left 18 months before completion." She paused. "And then I did 4 years of listening in hotel corridors and dispatch offices and corner stores, which turned out to be a different kind of program." Han nodded slowly, not with pity, with the assessment again. The weighing. "I'm going to recommend to Mr. Park that the consulting arrangement be extended," Han said, "through the end of the summit series. That's 3 weeks." Zuri said nothing. "The compensation would be structured accordingly, with a provision for formal contractual protection on both sides." "Why are you telling me this instead of him?" "Because he'll offer it regardless. I wanted you to know it comes from both of us." Han paused. "And because after what I watched in that room this morning, I believe you should have context for what you're walking into." "What am I walking into?" Han's voice didn't change temperature, but it changed texture slightly. "Taeyong's reassignment was not well received in certain quarters. He has relationships in this building, and outside it, that carry more weight than his title suggests. His family's investment in this company is not small." She folded her hands on the table. "I was told to step aside. He was not told quietly." Zuri let that sit for a moment. "He blames me. He blames the situation, which he has personalized in your direction." Han looked directly at her. "I want you to have 3 weeks of good work in this building before any of that becomes your problem. So I need you to come back this afternoon and finish today's session." Zuri looked at the empty food container in front of her. She looked at her hands. She thought about Tendai. She thought about the way Dr. Osei had said the rarest thing in any room, and the way she'd almost deflected it by instinct. She thought about the fact that Baek Sungho had answered her framework question with the smoothness of someone who had practiced that answer, or something very much like it, before the session started. "What time does the afternoon session begin?" she asked. 2 o'clock, Han said. "I'll be there at 1:45, Zuri said. Han stood. She was at the door before Zuri spoke again. "Director Han." She waited until the woman turned. "The liability clause. Is there a way to get the original drafting documentation reviewed by an independent source before the end of day?" Han's expression was unreadable in the way of someone who had already thought of the same thing. "I'll see what's possible," she said. She left. Zuri sat for another minute in the empty briefing room. The city outside was moving through its afternoon. Somewhere her motorcycle was parked in the hotel's service lot, in a space designated for vendor vehicles, next to a catering truck and 2 maintenance vans. Her helmet was in the small locker Yejin had arranged for her on the 2nd floor. She was not a delivery rider sitting at a conference table. She was also not, entirely, the person she'd been in that conference room 4 years ago before everything changed. She was something between those two things, in the specific uncomfortable way that in-between states feel before they resolve into something new or collapse back into something familiar. She pulled out her phone. She had 3 unread messages from the dispatch system, account notifications she'd been ignoring for 2 days, and one text from her father that said only, "How are things going? My daughter," with the particular punctuation of a man who had learned to text in his 60s and still treated the comma as a formal mark of affection. She typed back, "Better than yesterday. I'll call Sunday." She put the phone away. She went back into the room at 1:43, 2 minutes earlier than she'd said, and found Advocate Wanjiku already there, standing near the window with a tablet, reviewing something with the focused stillness of a person who had been in enough rooms to know that the 2 minutes before a session resumed were never actually quiet. Wanjiku looked up. "You found an interesting answer for the liability clause," she said. "I found an honest one," Zuri said. "Those are different things." "Sometimes," Zuri agreed. Wanjiku studied her for a moment. "Where did you study?" Zuri named the university. Wanjiku's eyebrows moved slightly. "That's a good program." "I didn't finish." "Neither did I," Wanjiku said and went back to her tablet. The afternoon session was harder than the morning. The third agenda item, the implementation timeline, pulled open a disagreement that had apparently been simmering below the surface of the entire summit, and was now, with the indemnity question raised and imperfectly resolved, refusing to stay below the surface. The disagreement was between the East African Consortium and the Korean firm about who bore operational responsibility during a specific 30-day phase that both sides referred to as the transition period and meant entirely different things by. The Korean team meant the period after handover when the regional teams assumed control. The East African Consortium meant the period before handover when local infrastructure was being prepared. The 30 days existed in both definitions. They occupied completely different positions in the sequence. Zuri caught this in the second exchange of the afternoon. She also caught that both sides had documents supporting their interpretation, which meant the ambiguity had been present in the original framework agreement and had traveled undetected through multiple drafts and revisions and 2 rounds of legal review. She did not announce this immediately. She spent 8 minutes quietly confirming it across 3 documents that were on the table in different languages, cross-referencing the timeline references with the phrasing used in each version. Then she said calmly, into the middle of what had become a genuinely heated exchange, "I need to stop the room for a moment." Everyone looked at her. "The disagreement about the transition period isn't a disagreement about what was negotiated," she said. "It's a disagreement about the sequence. Both definitions are present in the original framework document. They describe different 30-day windows, and neither side is wrong about what their document says. The silence was the kind that happens when people suddenly understand that they've been arguing about a problem that is both worse and more solvable than they thought." Dr. Mensah leaned forward. "Both definitions are in the same document?" "In different sections," Zuri said. "The operational clause uses one definition. The infrastructure clause uses the other. They were drafted by different teams at different points in the process and were never reconciled." Park Jun-seo spoke for the first time in 2 hours. "How long has this discrepancy been present?" Baek Sung-ho's jaw tightened so slightly that almost no one would have seen it. Zuri saw it. "I'd estimate since the 3rd revision," she said, looking at Baek while appearing to address the room. "Which would have been approximately 14 months ago." Another silence. This one had a different quality. It was the silence of multiple people recalculating the weight of the morning's liability clause conversation in light of new information. Advocate Wanjiku set down her pen with a small, precise sound. She looked at Baek Sung-ho. "Perhaps we should ensure that documentation review you promised this morning happens before close of business today," she said. Her voice was entirely pleasant. Baek nodded. His face was professionally composed, but his hand on the table was flat and pressed and still. The particular stillness of a person pressing something down. The session concluded at 5:15 without full resolution on the timeline issue, which was logged as pending clarification. The diplomatic language for a problem that everyone now knew existed and that someone was going to have to answer for. Park Jun-seo thanked the delegations formally and efficiently, the way a person thanks a room when they need the room to empty so they can deal with what just happened. The delegations filed out. Yejin was at the door managing the exit flow with her characteristic organized precision. Dr. Ose passed Zuri without stopping, but put one hand briefly on her shoulder, the lightest possible contact, the kind that carries information without requiring a word. Zuri was gathering her notes. She'd been taking notes in 4 languages simultaneously, a habit from graduate school that she'd never lost. When Park Jun-seo appeared beside her. "Walk with me," he said. They went down the corridor to a smaller room that turned out to be something between a lounge and a workroom, with a low table and 2 chairs and a window that looked out on a portion of Seoul that was neither its best nor its worst view. He sat. She sat across from him. "The drafting discrepancy," he said. "How certain are you?" "Completely certain about the discrepancy," she said. "The question of when it entered the document and whether it was accidental is not something I can determine from the text alone." He looked at her steadily. "But you have a read on it." "I have an impression." "Tell me." She considered how to say what she needed to say next, because there was a version of it that was careful and professional and technically stayed within the bounds of what she could confirm, and there was a version of it that was honest and direct and said what she actually thought, and she had been choosing the careful professional version for most of the day. "The document has 2 drafting registers," she said. "The way someone's writing changes when they've been at a draft for a long time versus when they're inserting something new into an existing structure. The transition period language in the infrastructure clause has a different register than the surrounding text. It feels like it was inserted rather than drafted from the same starting point." Park was quiet. "Which suggests," she continued, because she had come this far, and there was no useful version of stopping halfway, that someone added the second definition of the transition period to the document after the operational clause was already in place, which would mean it wasn't a drafting error. The word she hadn't said sat between them like something visible. Park Jun-seo looked at her for a long time. Outside, the Seoul evening had begun to lean toward dark. "Ms. Adebayo," he said finally, "what I'm about to offer you is no longer a 2-day consulting arrangement." She felt something in her chest shift. Not excitement. She didn't trust excitement anymore. Something more like the sensation of a door opening into a room she hadn't decided yet whether she wanted to enter. "The Director of International Communications position has been vacant for 7 months, he said. "We've interviewed 11 candidates. None of them could have done what you did in that room today." He paused. "I'd like you to consider it seriously." She said nothing. Her face, she was aware, was doing the thing it did when she was processing something she hadn't prepared to process. Very still, while everything beneath it moved fast. "I know what you're going to say," he continued. "You're going to tell me you don't have the formal credential, that the position has requirements you technically don't meet on paper, that there will be people in this building who will object loudly and with institutional weight behind them." "All of that is true," she said. "Also true," he said, "is what I watched you do today, and what Baek Sung-ho's documentation review is going to find this evening." His voice didn't change temperature, but something in it had hardened slightly at the edges, the way things harden when a person has made a decision and is now simply executing it. "I need someone who can find what Beck apparently couldn't or didn't find over 14 months, and I need them yesterday." Zuri looked at the low table between them. She looked at her notes in 4 languages. She thought about Kwon Tae-young's expression when she'd first walked into that conference room, and the family investment director Han had mentioned, and the way Baek's hand had been pressed flat against the table when Advocate Won Jiku had mentioned the documentation review. She thought about those words that hadn't been said. "If this isn't a drafting error," she said carefully, "then whatever is in that documentation review tonight is going to create a serious problem for someone in this company." "Yes," Park said. "And the Director of International Communications would be expected to be involved in managing that problem. Among other things," she looked at him, "you're not just offering me a job." "No," he said. He didn't pretend otherwise, which was the thing she would later identify as the moment she made her decision, though she didn't make it yet. "I'm asking you to walk into something that is already moving, with people in it who have interests, and a history I'm still understanding the shape of. I'm asking you to do that without a credential and without institutional backing, relying primarily on the thing you demonstrated in a conference room 2 days ago when you weren't supposed to be there." The light outside had shifted. The room had the specific quality of a space where a conversation has just changed what it is. "I haven't said yes," she said. "I know," he said. "I need 48 hours. I need your answer by tomorrow morning," he said. The documentation review results will be in by midnight. If they show what you think they might show, the situation moves quickly after that. She stood. He stood. They looked at each other in the way of two people who have just laid out a set of circumstances that neither of them entirely controls. "Tomorrow morning," she said. She walked out of the hotel into the Korean evening and retrieved her motorcycle from the service lot and put on her helmet and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Her phone had two new dispatch notifications, a text from Tendai with 3 question marks and nothing else, and a message from a number she didn't recognize that had been sent 47 minutes ago while she'd been in the afternoon session. The message was 4 words. "You should leave now." She stared at those 4 words for a long time. "You should leave now." The parking lot had the particular dead quality of service areas after business hours. Fluorescent light from one working fixture. The smell of exhaust and damp concrete. A catering truck with its back door slightly open revealing stacked empty trays. Nothing moving. No one nearby. She looked around anyway. The habit of someone who had learned, across enough years in enough cities, that messages like this one had senders, and senders had reasons, and reasons sometimes had a physical proximity to the moment of delivery. Nothing, just Seoul going about its evening on the other side of the lot's perimeter wall. She looked at the number again, not saved in her phone, not a number she recognized from any sequence she knew. She typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Not immediately. She waited 3 minutes, sitting on the motorcycle with the engine off, watching the screen. The message showed as delivered, not read. She started the engine and drove home. The apartment had the specific quality of a space that had been empty all day and knew it. She turned on the kitchen light and stood in the middle of the room for a moment doing nothing, which was unusual for her. Zuri Adebayo was not a person who stood in the middle of rooms doing nothing. She had learned early that stillness was expensive. It gave things time to catch up with you. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, spent 40 minutes reviewing everything she could find about Chorustar Global Logistics, which was Park Jun-seo's company, and about the consortium of African trade partners involved in the summit, and about Kwon Tae-yang, whose name appeared on a company investor page alongside a photograph that confirmed he was exactly the kind of person who looked the way he'd looked at her in that conference room. She found very little she didn't already know. The company was legitimate, profitable, and had been expanding its East African operations for 3 years with what looked like genuine strategic investment rather than the extractive shell games that often wore the same clothes. The African consortium was led by serious people with serious institutional backing. The summit was real. What she found, in the 43rd minute of her search, was a Business Journal article from 14 months ago about a personnel restructuring at Chorustar that had moved 3 senior executives into different roles. The article was brief and carefully worded in the way that articles about internal corporate turbulence are carefully worded. One of the executives mentioned was named Baek Sung-ho, who had moved from chief contract officer to legal counsel, a lateral title change that the article framed as an expansion of responsibilities. She read that sentence 3 times. Chief contract officer, moved to legal counsel, 14 months ago. The 3rd revision of the summit document had occurred approximately 14 months ago. She closed the laptop. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, a posture she'd unconsciously borrowed from somewhere, maybe from watching her father sit at his desk after a bad phone call, pressing his palms against the wood, like he was checking whether the ground was still there. Her phone buzzed. The unrecognized number. Not a message this time. A call. She answered, silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize, male, older than Park, speaking Korean with the cadence of someone who had spent time in a regional dialect before acquiring the standard. "You're asking questions you shouldn't be asking," the voice said. "I'm not asking questions," she said. "I'm doing my job." "You don't have a job yet." A pause that was somehow both unhurried and pressurized. "You should think carefully about whether you want one." "I'm thinking very carefully," she said. "Who is this?" The line went dead. She held the phone for a moment, then she set it face down on the table and sat in the kitchen with the light on and listened to the sounds of her building. A neighbor's television, the plumbing, a door closing 2 floors up, until her breathing slowed to something that felt like her own again. Then she called Park Jun-seo. He answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he was still awake and near his phone, which meant the documentation review was either finished or actively happening. "Someone just called me," she said. "Male, older, regional Korean accent, told me I was asking questions I shouldn't be asking. A silence on Park's end that was not the thoughtful kind. What number? She read it to him. She heard him writing it down. Did they threaten you directly? He asked. No, they were more careful than that. She paused. The Baek Sung-ho moved from chief contract officer. That happened 14 months ago. Another silence. Yes. You knew that. I knew the timeline, he said. I didn't know what it connected to until tonight. The documentation review found something. Yes. His voice was careful, controlled in the specific way that people who are managing their own response are controlled. Ms. Adebayo, I need to ask you to come in early tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Tell me what they found, she said. In person, he said. Not on this line. The line quality between them was fine. He didn't say this line is compromised. He said not on this line in a tone that meant the same thing. 7 o'clock, she said. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time, and when she did, it was the thin, restless kind of sleep that leaves you more tired than the waking was. She arrived at the Grand Lotus at 6:52. Not the service entrance this time. Park had texted her a guest access code that morning at 5:45, which meant he also hadn't slept much. She went through the main lobby, which was strange in the particular way that spaces are strange when you've only ever entered them through their hidden seams. Yejin met her at the elevator. She looked composed in the specific way of someone who had been briefed on something serious and had decided to be professional about it. She said good morning and led Zuri to a conference room on the 4th floor that was smaller and less formal than 3C, with a round table and no particular organizational hierarchy implied by the seating. Park was there. Director Han was there. Baek Sung-ho was not. There was a third person Zuri hadn't met, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the general bearing of someone who had spent a career in rooms where no one wanted her findings. She was introduced as Ms. Kwok, the company's internal audit director. Thank you for coming early, Park said. He looked like a man who had been awake since the documentation review results arrived and had spent the intervening hours deciding how to proceed. What I'm going to share with you is under attorney-client protection for the company. I need you to understand that before we begin. I understand, Zuri said. He nodded to Ms. Kwok. The audit director opened a folder. Her manner was precise and entirely without drama, which was the most alarming possible presentation for what she then described. The third revision of the Summit Framework document, the revision from 14 months ago, had introduced a definition of the transition period into the infrastructure clause that was inconsistent with the definition already present in the operational clause. The inconsistency was not accidental. Ms. Kwok had traced the version history through the company's document management system and found that the infrastructure clause revision had been made by a single user account outside of normal working hours and had not been flagged in the standard review cycle because the flag had been manually suppressed in the system. The user account belonged to Baek Sung-ho. The manual suppression of the review flag had been performed using an administrative override function that, according to the system logs, was accessed using Baek Sung-ho's credentials. But the access timestamp was on a Thursday evening when, according to building security records, Baek Sung-ho had left the office at 4:45 and had not returned until the following Monday. Someone used his credentials while he wasn't in the building, Han said. Not a question. His credentials were used, Ms. Kwok said carefully. Whether by him or by someone else with access to his login, I can't determine from the system records alone. Zuri had been listening. She spoke for the first time since Ms. Kwok had begun. The liability clause, she said, the one I flagged yesterday. Was it drafted under the same revision cycle? Ms. Kwok looked at her. Yes. The liability clause was modified in the same session, and both modifications benefit the same party in a dispute scenario? If interpreted the way the Swahili delegation's version implies, Ms. Kwok said, yes. The transition period definition and the liability scope would, in combination, shift a significant portion of operational risk onto the African consortium partners, while limiting the Korean firm's exposure during the highest risk phase of implementation. The room was very quiet. Zuri looked at Park Jun-seo. Who profits from that outcome? He met her eyes. The shareholders with the most to lose from implementation delays, which would include Kwon Tae-young's family investment, Han said quietly. She had her hands folded on the table. Her composure was the kind that takes real effort. Approximately 31% of the third-tier equity structure. The shape of it settled over the room like something physical. Kwon Tae-young had been in that conference room Tuesday. He had seen the professional interpreters fail to arrive. He had seen, presumably, an opportunity for the ambiguities in the document to go undetected, to work their way through the negotiation process, and emerge in the final signed agreement where they would be much harder to contest. Then a delivery rider had walked through the door and started finding things. Get her out. We don't need the help of someone like that in here. Not arrogance, not reflexive prejudice, or not only that, necessity. She had walked into a room where her presence was a problem, not because of what she looked like, but because of what she could hear, and someone at that table had understood that immediately. He had someone make the call last night, she said. Park didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The set of his jaw was confirmation enough. The anonymous tip message earlier in the evening, Han said. That, we believe, was someone else. Someone in Baek's position who may be looking for a way out. Zuri thought about the message. You should leave now. It had the texture of a warning, not a threat. The difference was real, and she'd been in enough difficult rooms to know it. Baek didn't do this for himself, she said slowly. The family investment is Tae-young's. Baek had access, but Baek didn't have motive, so not at this scale. He was the instrument. Which makes him potentially a witness, Park said. And a liability for Tae-young, she said, if Baek decides to cooperate. Which is why, Park said, and his voice had dropped slightly, not in volume but in register, the way voices drop when the topic becomes something that requires more care. What happens in the next 24 hours matters considerably. The summit resumes Friday morning. That's 36 hours from now. If the document discrepancies are raised formally before the summit concludes, Tae-young's position becomes untenable, she said. And the company's liability for what was in that document becomes an extremely complex conversation with 9 delegations, Han said. Zuri looked at the table, at the folder Ms. Kwok had brought, at the faces of the 3 people across from her. You're going to need to disclose, she said. Yes. To the delegations, before Friday. Yes. And you need someone who can communicate what happened to 9 parties in multiple languages in a way that preserves the summit and the company's credibility as far as is possible, and doesn't collapse the agreements that were legitimately reached. Yes, Park said. She understood now the full weight of the offer he'd made the previous evening. It was not a generous recognition of her talent. It was a calculated need dressed in generous language. And Park Jun-seo was honest enough, she thought, to know the difference and to have offered it anyway rather than pretending otherwise. I'll take the position, she said, but I need something from you. Name it. Full access to the document history and the system logs. Not through Ms. Kwok's filter, directly. I need to be able to verify what I'm communicating to those delegations from primary sources, not summaries. Done. And I need Advocate Wanjiku contacted directly before the general disclosure. She already suspects something. If she finds out in the room with everyone else, she'll treat it as another act of bad faith. Park looked at Han. Something passed between them. A silent negotiation in the language of people who have worked together long enough to speak that way. I'll contact her this morning, Han said. One more thing. Zuri looked at Park. Kwon Tae-young, where is he right now? At his family's residence in Gyeonggi, Park said. He's been told the summit is progressing and that his presence is not required this week. He doesn't know about the documentation review. Not yet. He will by end of business today, she said. The person who sent me that call last night will tell him, and when he knows we know, things will move quickly, Park said. You need legal counsel that isn't Baek Sung-ho, she said. Park almost smiled. Not quite. We retained external counsel at 6 this morning. She nodded. She stood. The others stood, which was slightly strange, a reflex of regard that she hadn't fully recalibrated to receiving. I'll need an office, she said, and Yejin if she's willing, and coffee, real coffee, not the machine in the hallway. Done, Park said. She walked out of the conference room and stood for a moment in the 4th floor corridor, alone, with the sounds of the hotel's morning operation moving around her like a current she was about to step into. She did not feel certain. She felt the way she imagined a person feels before they jump from a height into water they know is deep enough. Not calm, not excited, but past the point where the feeling matters to the decision. She pulled out her phone. She had 12 messages. 3 from the dispatch system, 1 from her father, 1 from Tendai with 4 question marks this time, and 7 from a number she recognized as belonging to a journalist named Yoon Ji-ho, who worked for a Korean financial news outlet and who had, apparently, been trying to reach her since 6:30 that morning. She stared at Yoon Ji-ho's name for a long moment. She had not spoken to any journalist. She had been in her apartment, then in this building. She had spoken to Park, to Han, to Yejin. She had received a threatening call from an unidentified number. A journalist had her personal phone number and had been calling since 6:30. She walked back to the conference room door and opened it. The 3 people inside looked up. "Someone leaked to the press," she said. The room went very still. Ms. Kwok closed her folder slowly. "A financial journalist named Yoon Ji-ho has my personal number and has been calling since 6:30 this morning," Zuri said. "I've never spoken to this person. I've never been quoted in any financial publication. The only people who know I'm involved in this summit are in this building." Hanmire's expression had shifted into something that was very controlled and very cold. "What's the outlet?" Zuri told her. Han and Park exchanged another of those looks. This one was different from the ones before it. This one had something sharper in it. "That outlet," Park said carefully, "has received placement funding from an investment group that includes Taeyang's family," Han said flatly. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when multiple realizations arrive simultaneously and the room needs a moment to process the combined weight. "He already knew," Zuri said, "about the documentation review. Someone told him last night and he didn't call me to threaten me or warn me. He went to his outlet and gave them my name." "Why you specifically?" Ms. Kwok asked. "Because I'm the easiest version of this story to tell," Zuri said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of it being steady and of the considerable effort that steadiness required. A delivery rider with no credential, no formal position, no institutional history with the company, suddenly in the middle of billion-dollar negotiations. Whatever version of this story gets published, I'm the variable that doesn't fit the frame. I'm the thing that looks like the anomaly. "He's going to frame you as the problem," Han said. "He's going to frame me as the cause of the disruption," Zuri said. "Whatever the story is, interpreter with undisclosed conflict of interest, unauthorized personnel influencing negotiations, unqualified consultant inserted by a senior executive with unclear motives. I'm the headline, and he's the concerned stakeholder raising questions." She said it cleanly. She had thought through it on her feet in the 30 seconds between seeing Yoon Ji-ho's name and walking back through that door, and the clarity of it was not comfortable, but it was clear. Park Jun-seo stood up from his chair. It was a small movement, but it had a quality to it, a decision solidifying into posture. "I'm calling external PR counsel," he said, "and I'm calling Taeyang directly." "Don't," Zuri said. He looked at her. "If you call him now, you're confirming that we know the shape of it. He doesn't have the story published yet. He's using the threat of publication to see how we respond. If you call, he has his response. He publishes and controls the timing." Park looked at her for a long moment. Han looked at her. Even Ms. Kwok, who had the professional detachment of someone who dealt in documented facts rather than human behavior, looked at her with something that was close to attention. "What do we do instead?" Park asked. "We move faster than he expects," she said. "We disclosed to the delegations this morning, before the story has time to develop a shape. If the delegations hear the truth from us first, with documentation, then whatever version of me Taeyang's outlet publishes is secondary to a company that proactively surfaced its own internal problem and addressed it transparently. That exposes us to significant legal and reputational risk," Han said. "Yes," Zuri said, "less than the alternative." Another silence. This one was different from all the others. It had the quality of a tide turning, that moment when the water stops going one direction and hasn't yet started going the other. "You'd have to be in the room when we disclose," Park said. "As a director of international communications, officially." "I know. There are people in that room who came in skeptical of you. After a leaked story that puts your name in a negative frame, some of them will have already read it by the time you walk in." "I know that too," she said. "You're certain?" She thought about Tendai's 4 question marks. She thought about her father's comma. She thought about Dr. Osei's hand on her shoulder, the lightest possible contact, the kind that carries information without requiring a word. She thought about the delivery jacket with the Quickstar logo hanging in a locker on the 2nd floor of this building, and about the way Quan Tai Yang had looked at her and said someone like that in a room full of people who had taken a breath and looked away. "Make the calls," she said. "Get the delegations assembled by 10. I need 2 hours with the documentation first." Yejin appeared in the doorway, already holding a tablet, already moving. "The office is ready on the 3rd floor," she said, "and the coffee is the real kind." Zuri followed her out. The 2 hours were the most concentrated work she had done in years. The documentation was extensive, and in some places technically dense. She worked through the version histories, the system logs, the cross-references between the two conflicting clause definitions, and built a clear sequential account of what the document had contained at each revision stage and how the current version differed from what the parties had originally negotiated. She also drafted, in 4 languages, the disclosure statement that Park would deliver to the assembled delegations. She drafted it 3 times. The first version was too apologetic. The second was too legalistic. The third said what needed to be said in the plainest possible language. There was an error in the document. The error was not accidental. The company had discovered it and was disclosing it immediately, and here was the documentation. At 8:40, Yejin knocked on the office door. "The journalist has published," she said. Her voice was very neutral. Zuri looked up. "Tell me." Yejin read from her tablet. The article was under Yoon Ji-ho's byline. It was short, published fast, which meant it had been drafted in advance. The headline used the words unauthorized, unqualified, and questions in close proximity. The article described an unidentified source raising concerns about an individual with no formal position who had been inserted into sensitive multinational negotiations at the direction of a senior executive. It described the individual as a food delivery contractor. It did not name Zuri directly. That would come in a follow-up piece. But it didn't need to. The information was specific enough that anyone in the delegations who had been in that room would know immediately. Zuri read it twice, the second time more slowly. "Okay," she said. Yejin waited. "Get Mr. Park. Tell him we move at 9:30, not 10. If anyone in those delegations has already seen this, I don't want them sitting with it for 90 minutes. "Yes," Yejin said, and was gone. Zuri sat for a moment with the article on the screen in front of her. She read the phrase, "Questions have been raised," and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite fear, and was perhaps the thing that lives between those two states. When you've been in enough situations to know that the next hour is going to require everything you have. She had delivered food in this building 8 months ago. She had kept her head down and never interfered in other people's lives, because interfering cost things she couldn't afford to spend. She had learned that lesson the way you learn lessons that leave marks. She was about to walk into a room full of people who represented 9 countries and billions of dollars in agreements, and who had just read, or would soon read, an article designed to make her look exactly like what Quan Tai-young needed her to look like. She was going to walk into that room as the director of international communications of a company that had just discovered it had a corruption problem nested in its own documents. She was going to walk in with a disclosure statement in 4 languages and documentation that proved the discrepancy, and a face that everyone in that room had already formed a full opinion about. She saved the translated documents. She closed the laptop. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen for just a moment. The shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the quick star jacket that was not, she noticed, what she was wearing today. She stood up. She was at the door when her phone buzzed. The message was from the unrecognized number from the night before. The one that had sent you should leave now. The one she believed was Baek Sung-ho looking for an exit. The message was a single document attachment. No text. She opened the attachment. It was a screenshot of a message thread. The sender name at the top was Quan Tai-yang. The recipient was a name she didn't recognize, but the content of the messages was clear. A sequence of instructions sent 14 months ago, directing someone to access the document management system using Baek Sung-ho's credentials during a specific window when Baek would be logged as absent from the building, and to make specific changes to 2 clauses in the Summit Framework document. The instructions were detailed, technical, written by someone who understood exactly what the changes would do to the liability allocation in a dispute scenario. Quan Tai-young had not used Baek's credentials. He had given someone else those credentials and told them exactly what to change and when. Baek Sung-ho had not been the instrument. He had been the frame, the name that would appear in the logs, the person the blame would land on if anything surfaced. He had known, or had begun to suspect. And he had sent her 4 words the previous evening and a document that morning that were, she now understood, not a warning and not an act of conscience. They were a calculation. He was giving her the evidence Taeyang needed to stay buried, because if Taeyang went down, Baek, who had looked the other way for 14 months, might survive in a way he couldn't if he remained silent. She stood in the doorway of the third-floor office holding her phone, the document open on the screen, the sounds of the hotel moving around her like water around something very still. She had the evidence. She had the disclosure statement. She had 38 minutes before the delegations assembled. She had just become the only person standing between a man with a media outlet and a family investment and a 14-month head start, and 9 countries that had come a very long way to sign agreements. They now couldn't sign until someone told them the truth about what was in the documents. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she knew, Tendai. She answered. "I saw an article," her sister said. No preamble, no brightness in her voice this time, just the truth of it. "I know," Zuri said. "Zuri." Tendai's voice was steady, in the way of someone working very hard to be steady. "What is happening?" Zuri looked down the corridor toward the elevator, toward the floor below, where 9 delegations were preparing to reconvene, toward the thing she was about to do, which had no clean version and no safe version and no version in which she emerged without cost. "Something I can't walk away from," she said. A silence on the line. Not confused. Her sister knew her. "Then don't," Tendai said. Zuri lowered the phone. She forwarded Beck's document to Park Junseo with a single line. "You need to see this before we go in." Then she walked toward the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting with her hands still and her face set and the full weight of what was coming pressing against her from a direction she couldn't entirely see yet, the way a storm front feels before the first rain. The elevator took 11 seconds to arrive. She counted them without meaning to, the way the mind reaches for countable things when everything else is moving too fast to hold. Park Junseo was in the corridor when the doors opened on the 3rd floor. He had his phone in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not panic, because she didn't think Park Junseo did panic, but something adjacent to it. The controlled version of a man whose calculations have just been revised by a significant variable. "I read it," he said. "All of it?" "The message thread. Yes." He looked at her with those still eyes that were not entirely still right now. "This changes the legal position considerably." "It changes everything," she said. "Beck isn't the architect. He's the scapegoat who's been sitting on the evidence for 14 months because he didn't know how far he was willing to go until this week." "Can we authenticate the screenshot?" "Not in the next 26 minutes, she said. "But we don't need authentication to use it. We need it to understand what we're disclosing and to whom." He fell into step beside her. They were moving toward the conference room at the end of the 4th floor corridor, and the hotel around them was operating at its normal morning register. Housekeeping carts, the distant sound of a breakfast service, a businessman on his phone near the ice machine who didn't look up as they passed. "Taeyang knows Beck sent it," Park said. "Almost certainly. Which means he knows the documentation exists outside of his control. Which means he's already making calls," she said. "Legal, media, whoever he has positioned to move fast. We have a window. It's smaller than it was an hour ago." Park stopped walking. She stopped too, half a step ahead, and turned to look at him. "There is a board member," he said. His voice had dropped. "Senior, Yu Chang-sik. He and Taeyang's father were in business together before the family invested in Chorustar. He has 7% of the primary equity structure and enough institutional relationship with 3 of our board seats to..." He paused. "If Taeyang reaches him before we reach the delegations, you can call an emergency board session that freezes all summit decisions pending internal review." She felt the shape of that land in her chest. How long does a freeze last? Minimum 72 hours. Effectively, the summit collapses. Delegations won't wait 72 hours with this level of uncertainty. They have their own institutional pressures. They go home. The agreements die in draft. Has Taeyang reached you yet? I don't know. They looked at each other in the corridor. The ice machine near the businessman hummed. A housekeeping cartwheel squeaked somewhere around the corner with the specific rhythm of something that needed oil. "Call you yourself," she said. "Right now, before we go in. If I call you and he's already spoken to Taeyang, then you know, and knowing is better than walking into a room and finding out when it's too late to respond." She held his gaze. Call him. I'll handle the room setup with Yejin. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. You're very calm, he said. I'm not, she said. I'm moving fast enough that it looks like calm. She left him in the corridor with his phone and went to find Yejin. The delegations began arriving at 9:22, 8 minutes ahead of schedule, which meant someone had sent word that the morning session was starting early. Zuri didn't know who had sent it. She stood near the door of conference room 3C with Yejin beside her, and she watched the faces as they came in. The French delegate, the one with the aggressive regional vocabulary, came in already looking at his phone. He glanced up when he passed her, and the quality of his glance was different from Tuesday's. It had the specific texture of someone who has read something and is now cross-referencing it against their direct experience. Dr. Mensah came in with 2 members of his team, talking quietly. He saw Zuri and nodded. His expression was careful rather than warm, which was its own kind of information about what he'd seen that morning. Advocate Wanjiku came in alone. She had been contacted by Han the previous evening, which meant she was the most informed person in the room about what was coming, other than the people who'd been in the 7 o'clock briefing. She met Zuri's eyes at the door and said nothing, and the nothing was communicative. I know. I'm ready. Do what you need to do. The delegate Zuri had been watching for arrived at 9:28. A man named Representative Ito from the Japanese Observer Group. Japan wasn't a signatory, but had investment interests in the implementation structure, who had been quiet and largely peripheral through Tuesday and Thursday. Today he came in with a different quality to his posture. A slight forward lean, a phone that he checked twice between the door and his seat. She clocked it, filed it. Dr. Osi came in last, alone, as she usually seemed to prefer. She stopped in front of Zuri. I read the article, she said. I know. The journalist didn't name you. No. Dr. Osei looked at her steadily. How much of what the article implies is accurate? None of it, Zuri said. But the reason it was published is accurate, and you'll understand that in about 10 minutes. Dr. Osei studied her face. Whatever she found there, she apparently found sufficient. Then let's begin, she said, and walked to her seat. Park Junseo came in at 9:31. He caught Zuri's eye from across the room and gave her a look that she interpreted in the language of expression she'd been reading her whole life, as, I reached you. The situation is not resolved, but it is contained for the moment. 2 things, both of which mattered. He took his position at the head of the table. Zuri sat to his right, not at the wall, not at the periphery where she'd been Tuesday when she'd walked in uninvited. At the table. In the seat that had Director of International Communications implied in every molecule of its positioning. She watched 3 of the delegates register this. She watched 2 of them look at each other. Park began to speak. Before we address today's agenda, he said, in Korean, and paused while Zuri rendered it in English and then in French without waiting to be asked. I need to share with this assembly some information that has a direct bearing on the documents we've been working from throughout this summit. The room went the particular quiet of people who expected something procedural and are sensing something else. He disclosed. All of it. The version history, the conflicting clause definitions, the system log evidence, the timeline. He spoke for 11 minutes, and Zuri translated every sentence in real time, Korean to English, to French, to Swahili, cycling without pause, finding the words in each language that preserved not just the meaning, but the register, formal, direct, without excessive apology, but without deflection. She was aware while doing this of the French delegate's jaw of Dr. Mensah's stillness, which was the stillness of someone absorbing something large, of Advocate Wanjiku, who was taking notes in a hand so controlled it barely moved, of Representative Ito, whose phone had disappeared from the table and who was now watching the room with an attention that had sharpened considerably. When Park finished, the silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted those too. Then the French delegate said, in rapid French, something that translated cleanly as, Are you telling us the documents we've been negotiating from for 3 days contain deliberate falsifications? The documents contain modifications that were made without authorization and without disclosure to the parties, Zuri said in French directly to him. The company is treating this as a serious internal matter and has engaged external legal counsel. The purpose of this disclosure is to ensure that no agreement reached in this summit is based on language that doesn't reflect what was actually negotiated. Who made the modifications? That is the subject of an ongoing investigation. That's not an answer. It's the accurate one, she said. I won't give you an inaccurate one. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that wasn't entirely hostility, more like the recalibration of a person who expected a deflection and received a straight line instead. Dr. Mensah spoke next. His voice was measured, each word placed with the care of someone who understood that what he said in this room would travel. What is the company's proposal for moving forward? Park answered. The proposal was an independent review of all documents by a mutually agreed third-party legal team, completed before any signatures were collected. The summit timeline would extend by 48 hours if necessary. All travel and accommodation costs for extended stays would be covered by Chorustar. Advocate Wanjiku's pen stopped moving. 48 hours, she said. If necessary, Park said. It will be necessary, Wanjiku said, not unkindly. A third-party review of documents at this complexity level will take at minimum 48 hours, done properly. She paused. Done properly is the only way I'm recommending my clients accept it. Agreed, Park said. Wanjiku looked at Zuri, not at Park. At Zuri. Who will be the company's point of contact for the review process? I will, Zuri said. A beat. The French delegate looked at her. The article this morning was published by an outlet with financial ties to the individual whose family investment benefits most from the document modifications, Zuri said. Her voice was flat, factual. She had decided in the elevator that she was not going to perform composure in this room. She was going to be composed, which was different, and she was not going to perform innocence. She was going to state what was true and let the room do with it what rooms do. I'd recommend reading it in that context. The French delegate's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger, with the expression of someone updating a calculation. Representative Ito spoke for the first time. His English was precise and careful. The individual referred to, he is a shareholder in this company. He is, Park said, and his position on this summit's outcomes was aligned with the modifications in the document. The investigation will establish that, Park said. The investigation, Ito said, or this room. He looked around the table with the quiet authority of someone who had been peripheral by choice and was choosing now to be something else. I think several of us arrived this morning with a fairly clear picture of what the article was designed to accomplish. The question is what we do with the morning we have. Zuri looked at him. He was about 60, with reading glasses in his breast pocket, and a stillness that reminded her, slightly, of Park Jun-seo, not in character, but in methodology. The stillness of someone who conserves. What would you suggest? She asked him directly. He considered. I'd suggest we spend the next 2 hours conducting a joint review of the clauses in question with translation support, so that every party in this room can confirm for themselves what the documents actually say versus what was apparently inserted. And then we adjourn for the independent review with a shared record of what this room agreed was the intended language. Dr. Osei leaned forward slightly. It was the first time she'd spoken. I second that. Dr. Mensah nodded. Wanjiku looked at Park. Can you provide original drafting records, pre-modification, for the clauses in question? Yes, Park said. Ms. Kwok is prepared to present the version history to the room. Then I agree with Representative Ito's proposal, Wanjiku said. Let's see what we actually negotiated. The morning cracked open differently than Zuri had planned. She had expected resistance, procedural challenges, the French delegate's particular brand of formal obstruction. She had not expected Representative Ito to step forward. She had not expected the room to coalesce around a working session rather than fracturing into separate caucuses. She filed that away. Rooms were like languages. You could prepare for them, but the living version was always doing something the preparation hadn't covered. For the next 2 hours, she worked. Ms. Kwok came in with the version history documentation and walked the room through it with the same precise, drama-free manner she'd used in the morning briefing. Zuri translated every word. She also handled the questions. And there were many, some of them sharp, and some of them pointed in directions that required careful navigation. In 4 languages, maintaining consistency across every version, catching twice when the same question was being asked in 2 languages, and the different phrasings were creating subtly different impressions of the answer. She was aware, throughout all of it, of her body. The low back pain that had been a persistent companion since her delivery years. The specific tension at the base of her neck that appeared when she was moving between languages at speed. The coffee she'd had at 7 that was now several hours behind her and making its absence known. She was aware of these things the way you're aware of the ground under your feet when you're running. Not focused on it, but using it as data. Her hands on the table in front of her were steady. She kept checking. They stayed steady. At 11:40, Han Mirai appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that Zuri recognized immediately. Not the look of a person with new information. The look of a person with information that has just become urgent. Zuri caught Yejin's eye and made a small gesture. Yejin moved quietly to Han's position at the door. A brief, inaudible exchange. Yejin turned and looked at Zuri, and the look confirmed it. She waited for the sentence being translated at the table to complete. Advocate Wanjiku was making a point about the indemnity clause language, and then said smoothly, in English, "Could we take a 5-minute break? I think coffee would serve us all at this point." The relief in the room was immediate. People had been in concentrated attention for 2 hours, and their bodies knew it. She was out the door in 30 seconds, and was in the corridor, and with her was someone Zuri hadn't expected. Baek Sung-ho, who looked like a man who had spent the night making a decision and the morning living with it. He was in yesterday's shirt. His hair was imperfectly arranged. He looked, for the first time since she'd seen him, like a person rather than a position. "He's here," Han said. Her voice was very low. "In the building, lobby level." Zuri didn't need to ask who. "Taeyang," she said. "He came in through the main entrance 20 minutes ago with 2 lawyers and a man I don't recognize." Han's composure was intact, but thinner than it had been. "He's requested an emergency meeting with the summit delegates. He told the front desk he has information material to the integrity of the summit process." The corridor felt suddenly narrower. "He's going to try to present before we finish the joint review. If he reaches the room before we conclude, He doesn't get to the room," Zuri said. Han looked at her. "He has a legitimate shareholder standing to request a meeting." "He has shareholder standing. He doesn't have standing in this summit process, which is a contractual framework between the delegations and the company. Park is the company's representative in this room, not Taeyang." She looked at Baek. "Is that accurate?" Baek Sung-ho looked at her with the expression of a man who has run out of intermediate positions. "Technically, yes," he said. His voice was hoarse. "The summit protocol designates the CEO as sole company representative in session. A shareholder can't interrupt proceedings without CEO authorization." "Does Park know he's here?" she asked Han. "I'm telling Park right now." Zuri looked at the corridor. The distance from where she was standing to the elevator to the lobby to Kwon Taeyang and 2 lawyers and an unidentified 4th person. "I need to go down there," she said. Han's head turned sharply. "That is not—" "He came here to create a scene that gets captured and reported," Zuri said. "He came here because the morning session is going better than he expected, and he needs to interrupt it with something that looks, on camera or in print, like a legitimate challenge. If Park goes down, it's a confrontation between 2 executives and the story writes itself. If I go down—" She stopped. "If I go down, I can assess what he has and buy time." "He'll eat you alive," Han said. There was no cruelty in it. It was an assessment. "He'll try," Zuri said. "He's been trying since Tuesday." She went to the elevator before Han could find the next argument. The lobby of the Grand Lotus had the high-ceilinged, acoustically complex quality of spaces designed to impress, which meant that voices carried in directions the speakers didn't always intend. She heard Kwon Taeyang before she saw him. Not his words, but the register of his voice, which was performing controlled outrage in the way of someone who has rehearsed controlled outrage. "I was standing near the concierge desk with 2 men in suits who had the specific physical economy of lawyers, nothing wasted, everything positioned, and a 4th man who she now recognized from her research the previous evening as a communications consultant whose firm had handled media relations for several of the same investment groups that had funded Yoon Ji-ho's outlet. The communications consultant was the most dangerous person in that cluster, not because he had power in the room, but because he knew exactly how to make power look different from what it was. Taeyang saw her before she was halfway across the lobby. His expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then something that settled into a kind of deliberate contempt that she understood was performance. He was establishing, for whoever might be watching, what he thought of her before she opened her mouth. "Miss Adebayo," he said. He said her name with the specific emphasis of someone demonstrating that they have done research. "I'm here to see the summit delegates." "I know why you're here," she said. She stopped at a distance that was close enough to be direct and far enough to not be physically crowding. She had thought about the geometry on the elevator down. "Mr. Park has been informed. He'll be with you shortly." "I don't need Park's permission to speak to international delegates. In an active summit session, you do," she said. "The protocol is in the session agreement that your family's legal team signed when the investment was structured." Section 12, paragraph 4. Summit proceedings are insulated from shareholder intervention during active session. One of the lawyers moved slightly. A small adjustment of weight that she registered as confirmation. He knew the clause, which meant they'd looked it up, which meant they knew she was right and were calculating whether to push anyway. Tae-young's eyes hadn't left her face. "You're a delivery contractor who's been in this building for 4 days, he said. His voice was very controlled. "You've been inserted into a sensitive international process by a CEO who, I would argue, has his own reasons for placing an unqualified individual in a position of influence." "Make that argument to the board," she said. "This morning you can sit in the lobby." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I have information about this process that the delegates need to hear." "You have a version of events that serves your interests," she said. "The delegates have spent the last 2 hours reviewing primary documentation. They're fairly well informed at this point." The communications consultant spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth in the specific way of people who treat conversation as terrain to be managed. "Ms. Adebayo, I think there's a way to handle this that works for everyone." "I'm not looking for something that works for everyone," she said, looking at him directly. "I'm looking for something that's accurate." He smiled. It was a professional smile with nothing behind it. "Of course. The question is, who determines what's accurate?" "In the next hour," she said. "The documents do." Tae-young stepped forward. Not aggressively. He was too controlled for that, too aware of the lobby and the desk staff and the sightlines. But he closed the distance by about 18 inches, which was a statement about hierarchy being made through space rather than words. "You found the message thread," he said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. "From Bayek." She looked at him. "He sent it to you last night," Tae-young said, "which means he's decided to cooperate with whatever Park's building against me." His voice was entirely level. "You should know that what Beck sent you is a screenshot of a message thread from a device he no longer has access to. He altered it before he sent it. The timestamps are inconsistent with the actual communication record, which my legal team has already obtained from the carrier." The lobby air conditioning moved the air between them. She held his gaze. Her face was doing the thing she needed it to do, neutral. Behind it, her mind was running the statement he'd just made at speed, checking it against what she'd seen. The timestamps. She had looked at them twice. She had not cross-referenced them against carrier records because she didn't have access to carrier records. He was watching her process this. She knew he was watching. She kept her face where it needed to be. "That claim will be examined," she said. "By the time it's examined," he said, "the summit will be in a very different position than it is right now." "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation." He tilted his head slightly, the performance of reasonableness. "Ms. Adebayo, I don't have a problem with you personally. I have a problem with a process that has been compromised by a senior executive using an unqualified outside contractor to pursue an internal agenda." He paused. "Walk away from this. You're not equipped for what happens next." The sentence sat there. She thought about Tuesday morning. She thought about the delivery bags and the faded jacket and the way he'd said someone like that as if she were furniture that had gotten in the way. She thought about this graduate program she'd left and the years of corridors and the medication paperwork and Tendai's voice on the phone saying, "Then don't." She thought about the phrase, "you're not equipped," and what it meant in his mouth, and what it had always meant in the mouths of people who said versions of it to her, and the specific exhaustion of having spent years proving it wrong by just continuing to exist in rooms where people said it. She looked at Kwon Tae-young. She looked at him directly, without performance, without the professional neutral she'd been maintaining. "The last time you told me to leave a room," she said, "I stayed. And everything that happened after that was the result of what I found when I stayed." She paused. "I'll let Mr. Park know you're here." She turned and walked back toward the elevator. She did not move quickly. She did not look back. Her hands, at her sides, were not steady this time. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. The moment the doors closed, she exhaled. A long, controlled breath that she'd been holding in some form since she'd stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. Her back was against the elevator wall, and the numbers were climbing, and she was running Tae-young's claim about the timestamps through her mind with a focus that was beginning to feel like something serrated. If the timestamps were altered, the document was compromised. If the document Baek had sent her was compromised, the evidence she'd forwarded to Park was unreliable. If it was unreliable and they'd already disclosed based on it, the disclosure itself could be challenged as acting on falsified information. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. Park was in the corridor with his phone pressed to his ear and the expression of a man who has just received information he would have preferred not to have received. He saw her face. He ended the call. "He claims the timestamps are altered," she said. "I know." Park's voice was tight, controlled, but tighter than she'd heard it. "My external counsel just told me. Tae-yang's legal team filed a complaint with the carrier at 6:45 this morning, before the review even started." Before. She processed that. "He filed before he came here," she said. "He knew Baek had sent it. He went for the carrier record to preempt the evidence before we could verify it. Yes, can we verify the screenshots independently? The actual device? Baek's corporate device was wiped remotely," Park said. "This morning at 7:12. She stared at him. "Someone accessed the corporate device management system and executed a remote wipe on Baek's phone," Park said. "At 7:12 a.m., while we were in the briefing room." "Who has access to the device management system?" "3 people, Park said. "The IT director, myself." He paused. "And the administrator level, which Tae-yang's family's IT firm set up when they came on as investors, and which we—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "Which we never fully segregated from their access." The corridor was very quiet. "He wiped the device to destroy the original messages," she said. "And then he came here with the carrier records that show timestamps inconsistent with the screenshot. Because without the device, we can't prove the screenshot was accurate." "Without the device or another copy of the original messages," Park said. "Yes." She stood in the corridor with the weight of the whole thing pressing down on her from a direction she now fully understood. Tae-young had moved in multiple directions simultaneously, before dawn, with precision and preparation, and she had been in her room thinking she was ahead of him while he was already 3 moves past where she was looking. She thought about the communication consultant in the lobby, the prepared smile, the way he'd said who determines what's accurate. Her phone buzzed, a number she'd never seen before. She answered, a woman's voice, low and quick, speaking Korean. "I'm Beck's wife. He told me to call you if—" A breath. "He kept a copy. Not on the device. On a personal account that the corporate system doesn't touch. He didn't tell you because he wasn't sure you'd need it." Another breath. "He's telling me to ask, do you need it?" Zuri looked at Park. Park was looking at her with the expression of someone watching a door that might or might not be about to open. "Yes," she said into the phone. "Tell me exactly how to access it." The woman spoke quickly, precisely, the words of someone relaying information they've memorized under pressure. An email account. A password. A specific folder named with a date from 14 months ago. Zuri was already moving toward the office door. "Park," she said, without turning around. "Get Yejin, get a device we know is clean, and get Ms. Kwak. We have 4 minutes before the break ends, and the delegates come back to the room, and I need to know what's in that folder before they do." He was moving before she finished the sentence. She pushed through the office door and opened the laptop on the desk, and her hands were moving on the keyboard while her mind was running the access details she'd been given, and the account loaded, and the folder was there. And inside it were not screenshots but the original message thread, exported in full with metadata intact, sender verification, delivery receipts, read timestamps that had nothing to do with the carrier records Tae-yang had spent the morning constructing a story around. Because Baek Sung-ho had not screenshotted the messages, he had exported them from the original account, with every technical layer of authentication that a screenshot would never carry. Ms. Kwok came through the door with her reading glasses already on and her folder already open, and the specific forward lean of a woman who has been in audit work long enough to know when evidence is about to matter. Zuri turned the laptop toward her. Ms. Kwok looked at the screen. She looked for 30 seconds. Her expression did not change, but something in her posture did. A slight settling, a consolidation, the way a person's body reads before they say something definitive. This is authenticated export, Ms. Kwok said. The metadata is intact. This is not a screenshot. She looked up. This is the original. Park was in the doorway. Behind him, she could hear the delegates beginning to return from the break. Voices in the corridor, the particular sound of a room reassembling. He looked at Ms. Kwok. Can you present that in the room? I can present what it is and what it shows, she said. Yes. He looked at Zuri. She looked at the door. Behind it, 9 delegations were taking their seats. Below in the lobby, Kwon Tae-yang was standing with his lawyers and his communications consultant, waiting. On a phone somewhere in the city, a journalist named Yoon Ji-ho was either waiting for instructions or drafting the follow-up article that would name her directly. She had the evidence. She had the room. She had exactly the window that Tae-yang had tried to close, and that Bayek's wife had just reopened with a phone call made at the last possible moment before it would have been too late. She looked at Park. Get the external legal counsel on the phone. They need to know about the metadata before we go back in. She picked up the laptop, and someone needs to tell the front desk that the shareholder in the lobby does not have authorization to interrupt these proceedings under Section 12, Paragraph 4, and if he attempts to come upstairs, they are to call security and document everything. Park was already on his phone. Zuri walked to the door. Her back ached. Her head was doing the specific thing it did when she had been running on adrenaline and concentration for too long. A faint pressure behind her eyes, a slight lag between thought and word that she knew from experience and knew how to compensate for. She had translated for 9 countries under diplomatic pressure for 3 days. She had been threatened, discredited, publicly framed, and told twice to leave a room where she was the only person who understood what was actually being said. She put her hand on the door. Behind it, the room was settling into its seats. She could hear Advocate Wanjiku's voice asking someone a procedural question. She could hear the quiet, the particular productive quiet of a group that has been working hard and is ready to work harder. She pushed the door open and walked in, and every face in the room turned toward her, and she looked back at all of them with the full weight of what she was carrying and what she was about to do. And she opened her mouth and said, in 4 languages in sequence without stopping, that there was a development in the documentation review that the room needed to hear before they proceeded, and that it would take approximately 10 minutes to present, and that after they heard it, she believed they would understand why the next hour was going to determine everything. The room went very still. Outside, in the lobby 11 floors below, Kwon Tae-yang's phone began to ring. She stood at the head of the table, and she did not look like someone who had slept well or eaten enough, or come through the last 72 hours without cost. She looked like what she was, a person who had taken a series of hits and was still standing, which is not the same thing as being unharmed. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that has texture to it. She set the laptop on the table where everyone could see the screen, and she said, in English first and then in French without pausing between them, "What you're looking at is an authenticated message export from a private account, not a screenshot, an original export with full metadata, sender verification, delivery timestamps, read receipts. Mrs. Kwok is going to walk you through what the technical authentication means. I'm going to tell you what the messages say." Ms. Kwok took up position beside the laptop. She was wearing her reading glasses and carrying her folder, and she had the unhurried manner of someone who has delivered findings in difficult rooms before and understands that speed is the enemy of credibility. She explained the export format. She explained the metadata fields visible at the top of each message, the cryptographic identifiers, the carrier-level timestamps, the delivery chain. She explained, in plain language, why these elements could not be retroactively altered without detection, and why they were fundamentally different from a screenshot, which captured only visual appearance. Zuri watched the room while Ms. Kwok spoke. She watched Advocate Wanjiku, whose pen was moving in small, precise strokes. Not notes, she realized, but something more like a diagram, a visual map of the information structure. She watched Dr. Mensah, who had his hands flat on the table in front of him, and was listening with the absolute stillness of someone for whom this information was reorganizing other things, earlier things he had half understood and was now understanding fully. She watched Representative Ito, who was watching her rather than the screen, which she took as its own kind of statement. She watched the French delegate. His name was Lefebvre. She had finally learned it this morning from Yejin. who had his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something that was professionally skeptical, but whose eyes were doing something different from his posture. His eyes were moving between the screen and Ms. Kwok, with the rapid tracking of a person who is following the argument and finding, against his preference, that it holds together. When Ms. Kwok finished, Zuri began to read the messages. She read them in Korean first, from the screen, slowly enough for the room to follow the cadence even without understanding the language. Then she translated, in English, each message in sequence. The instructions were specific. The date was specific. The target clauses were identified by section and paragraph. The person being addressed was not named in the messages, addressed only as a contact alias, but the instructions referred to using Beck SI's credentials in a phrasing that was not a question but an assumption of access already arranged. The room was silent in a way that rooms are silent when the silence is doing work. She finished the last message. She looked up. Advocate Wanjiku spoke first. The individual who sent these messages is currently in the lobby of this building, Zuri said, with 2 lawyers and a communications consultant. He filed a complaint with the mobile carrier at 6:45 this morning to preempt this evidence. He also arranged a remote wipe of the device held by the person whose credentials were used at 7:12 this morning. To destroy the original messages, Wanjiku said. To destroy what he believed was the only copy, Zuri said. He didn't know about the export. A pause that had considerable weight in it. How did you get the export? Someone who had more to lose by staying silent than by speaking, Zuri said. She did not say Beck's name. She did not say his wife's name. She would never say either of those things in a room she didn't fully control. And this room, for all that she had been managing it, was not hers. Dr. Osei spoke. She had been the last to arrive that morning and had said almost nothing since. When she spoke, the room oriented toward her. The way rooms orient toward voices that have been quiet long enough to accumulate gravity. Ms. Adebayo, what is this person's relationship to the company's equity structure? He represents a family investment of approximately 31% of the third-tier equity. His removal from shareholder standing is a board decision, not a summit decision. She paused. What the summit can do is proceed with the document review on the basis of the original negotiated language, the pre-modification version, and ensure that what gets signed reflects what was actually agreed. The legal consequences for the individual are a separate process. Dr. Osei looked at her for a long moment. And if he attempts to obstruct that process from the lobby? He doesn't have the standing to interrupt active summit proceedings, Zuri said. Section 12, paragraph 4 of the session protocol. Park Jun-seo is the company's designated representative in session. That designation holds unless a board resolution removes it. She looked at Park. Is there a board resolution in process? There is not, Park said. I spoke with board member Yu Chang-sik at 8 this morning. He is aware of the situation and has indicated he will not support any motion to freeze summit proceedings pending internal review. Lefebvre uncrossed his arms. It was a small thing, but Zuri noticed it the way she noticed small things, as a shift in the room's temperature. You said Mr. Yu was informed. When did he become aware of the document discrepancy? This morning, Park said. Did he know before this morning? A silence. That is something the board investigation will need to establish, Park said. Lefebvre looked at Zuri. Your assessment? She had not expected him to ask her directly. She also had an answer because she had been thinking about Yu Chang-sik since Park had mentioned him the previous day. I think Mr. Yu is a careful man who has known for some time that something in the document structure wasn't right, she said. I think he made a calculation about when it became more costly to ignore it than to address it. This morning, that calculation changed. She paused. That's not exoneration. That's people behaving the way people behave. Lefebvre studied her. Then, for the first time, he gave her the minimal but real nod of a person who has decided to trust the information, if not yet the source. Then I suggest, he said, that we proceed. They worked through the afternoon. The independent review process was organized in 2 hours and began in 4. An external legal firm that Advocate Wanjiku's consortium had used before and trusted brought in on emergency retainer and given the complete version history documentation and the authenticated message export. Zuri worked alongside them, not as a lawyer but as the person who could tell them, in real time, whether the translation of a specific phrase in the pre-modification document matched what 3 different parties in 3 different languages had understood they were agreeing to. It was grueling work, the kind of work that demanded not just fluency but precision. The difference between a word that was close and a word that was accurate, which in legal language was sometimes the difference between a binding obligation and an aspiration. She caught herself twice reaching for the expedient translation, the one that smoothed over a rough edge, and pulling herself back, making herself sit with the roughness and find the words that held it honestly. Her neck ached. She drank 3 cups of coffee from the machine in the hallway, which was not the real kind because the real kind had run out at noon, and no one had thought to order more in the chaos of the morning. She ate half a triangle of a sandwich that Yejin brought in at 2:30 and left the other half because her stomach had decided it was not interested in food. At 4:47, the external legal team's lead partner, a woman named Attorney Choi who had the compact, durable energy of someone who had been in emergency legal situations often enough to have developed a personal methodology for them, came to find her in the side room where she had been working. "The operational clause is clean," Attorney Choi said. "Pre-modification language reflects what the parties described as their original understanding. The transition period definition in the infrastructure clause has been corrected to match the operational clause definition. The liability scope clause has been restored to the UNI's framework reading." She paused. "The documents are ready." Zuri looked at her. "All of them?" "All of them." She sat with that for a moment. The weight of 2 days pressing down and then, very slowly, beginning to lift. Not gone. The weight didn't go exactly. It redistributed, but different. "Thank you," she said. Attorney Choi nodded. She had the particular professionalism of someone who didn't require more than that. She left. Zuri sat alone in the side room for approximately 90 seconds. She allowed herself those 90 seconds because she understood, in the practical way she understood most things about herself, that what came next was going to require her to be entirely present, and she needed a brief window to close the door on the room she'd been in for the last 3 days before she walked into the one she was walking into next. She thought about a version of herself standing outside a conference room door, hearing voices in 4 languages, carrying food bags, telling herself to walk away. She thought about what that version had not known and could not have known about the next 72 hours. She picked up her notes and her phone and went back to the room. The signing happened at 6:15 in the evening in conference room 3C, with the natural light coming through the windows at the angle that meant the day was mostly done. 9 delegations. Corrected documents. Attorney Choi's team as witnesses. Ms. Kwok present with the version history documentation as official record. Park Jun-seo signed for the company. He signed last, after every delegation had signed, and when he put the pen down he looked across the table and found Zuri standing at the wall. She had stepped back from the table as the signing began, giving the moment to the people who had come from far away to reach it. And he held her gaze for a moment that didn't need any words added to it. Advocate Wanjiku signed with the specific deliberateness of a person who has been in enough rooms where things went wrong to take nothing for granted when something goes right. When she finished, she looked at the signature on the page for a moment before she set the pen down, as if verifying that it was still there. Dr. Mensah signed and then, in a departure from his habitual stillness, put his palm flat on the document for a moment, just a moment. Then he removed his hand and nodded once at no one in particular and looked at his team. Dr. Osei signed without ceremony. When she stood up, she caught Zuri's eye across the room and gave her the same look she'd given her at the door on Tuesday. Not warm, exactly. More like recognition. The acknowledgement of one person who has been in difficult rooms by another person who has been in difficult rooms. Representative Ito signed and then looked around the room with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched something complicated resolve into something simple and found the resolution instructive. When it was done, the room did not erupt. There was no celebration in the conventional sense. People shook hands. They spoke in their own languages to their own teams. The particular energy of the afternoon, focused, pressurized, running on a shared understanding that something important was at stake, began to decompress slowly, the way high-pressure systems decompress, gradually, with some turbulence, and not all at once. Lefebvre came to stand beside Zuri near the wall. "You were right about the liability clause," he said, in French. "I was careful about it," she said, in French. "I'm not sure that's the same thing." He looked at her for a moment. "I was about 60, she thought, with the kind of face that had done a lot of its living in rooms like this one. "I've been in international negotiations for 30 years, he said. "I've worked with perhaps 40 professional interpreters in that time. You do something I have seen very rarely." She waited. "You translate what people mean," he said, "not what they say." She thought about her grandmother switching from Ndebele mid-sentence. She thought about the graduate program she'd left. She thought about 4 years of service corridors and dispatch offices and the specific education of listening to people who never expected to be heard. "I had good teachers," she said. He nodded and moved away to join his team. Kwon Tae-young left the building at 3:41 that afternoon, which she knew because Ye-jin had been monitoring the lobby situation and had sent her a text. He left without reaching the summit floor. He left without the confrontation he had apparently come to stage. He left with his 2 lawyers and the communications consultant, and the front desk staff documented the departure the way Zuri had requested, with timestamps and descriptions that became part of the summit record. She heard through Park's external counsel that Tae-young's family's legal team filed a shareholder complaint with the corporate registry at 5 o'clock. The complaint alleged procedural irregularities in the summit process and requested a board audit. It was the legal equivalent of the morning's lobby visit, a formal structure built to look like accountability while functioning as interference. The board met 8 days later. By that time, the authenticated message export had been submitted to 3 separate forensic analysis firms, all of which confirmed the metadata integrity. The complaint's central claim, that the export evidence had been manipulated, was dismantled in the first 40 minutes of the board session. Baek Sung-ho submitted a full statement. He had spent the 8 days between the summit conclusion and the board meeting with his own legal counsel, and the statement was careful and specific and covered 14 months of decisions he had made or failed to make in clear procedural language that left very little room for interpretation. He had not known, initially, the full scope of what Tae-young was doing with the document modifications. He had understood, by the time the summit was announced, that what had been done was wrong. He had made the calculation, repeatedly, that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of silence. He had been wrong about that calculation. He said so in the statement. He said it without drama, which made it more difficult to dismiss than drama would have been. Kwon Tae-young's family investment in Chorustar was frozen pending investigation. His removal from all advisory roles was ratified by a board vote of 9-2. The 2 dissenting votes were board members whose institutional relationships with the Kwon family's investment group were subsequently reviewed as part of the same investigation. Zuri was not in the board meeting. She read the summary that Attorney Choi sent her the following morning with the particular relief of someone receiving a letter that confirmed something they had believed but couldn't yet afford to trust. The formal offer letter for the Director of International Communications position came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the summit concluded. It came by email because the paper version had gone to her delivery address, which was still the address on her account from the Quickstar job she had not yet officially resigned from. She printed the email. She read it at the kitchen table in her apartment with coffee that was the real kind from the jar of ground beans she'd bought at the corner store whose owner no longer followed her between the shelves. She read it twice. The terms were what Park had described. The compensation was formal now, structured across salary and benefits and a provision for continuing education that she had negotiated herself in a 20-minute conversation with Han Mirai that she would later remember as the first negotiation she'd conducted entirely on her own behalf in 4 years. She signed it. She took a photograph of the signed page and sent it to Tendai. Tendai called 11 seconds later. Zuri answered and held the phone away from her ear for the first 3 seconds, because Tendai was not, in that moment, being quiet. When the sound settled, Tendai said, "Tell me everything." She told her. Not the board outcome, she'd told her that already, but the texture of it. The lobby. Lefebvre's arms uncrossing. The 90 seconds alone in the side room before the signing, the way Advocate Wanjiku's palm had rested on the document for a moment. Tendai listened without interrupting, which she could do when something mattered enough to deserve the full silence. "You sound different," Tendai said when she finished. "Different how?" "Tired," Tendai said, but like you chose the tired." Zuri thought about that. "Yeah," she said. "I think that's right." Her sister was quiet for a moment. "Dad called me last night," she said. "He saw your name in something online. He couldn't fully understand what the article said, but he knew it was about you." Zuri felt something tighten in her chest. "What did you tell him?" I told him his daughter was in a big meeting and she handled it, Tendai said. He asked me 3 times if you were okay. I said yes 3 times. He said, "That's the Adebayo way." A pause. He cried a little. He doesn't know I know. Zuri sat at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment. The light was coming through the window at the morning angle. Outside, Seoul was moving through its ordinary business with the usual indifference. A neighbor's door opened and closed. The plumbing did something in the walls. "How's the treatment going?" she asked. "Good week," Tendai said. 3 good weeks in a row. Keep counting. Always. She went to the office for the first time as director on a Monday. The office was on the 4th floor of Chorustar's main building, 3 floors above the conference rooms, with a window that looked out on a portion of the city that was neither landmark nor industrial, but the living middle of things. A desk, 2 chairs for visitors, a whiteboard on one wall. Yejin had already organized the desk with the items Zuri had said she'd need: a Korean-English legal dictionary, an Amharic reference grammar, 2 notebooks, a coffee maker that was not the machine kind. She stood in the office for a minute before she sat down, looking at it with the mixed feeling of things that have been wanted for a long time, and then arrived in a form that doesn't quite match the shape you'd been carrying in your head. Not disappointment, something more nuanced. The recognition that what you had imagined and what you had earned were the same thing, and also different things, because imagining happens in a space without friction, and the earned version has the marks of everything it took to get here. She sat down. There was a folder on the desk. She opened it. Inside was a preliminary briefing document for the next phase of the summit implementation, a working group that would meet in Nairobi in 6 weeks to address the operational details of the transition period, now correctly defined, now understood the same way by everyone at the table. She read the briefing document. She made notes in the margin in 3 languages, questions that needed answers before the Nairobi meeting, terminology that needed to be verified. A cultural protocol question she flagged, with a small asterisk and a note to herself to call a contact she had at the East African Chamber of Commerce, who had always answered her calls even when she had been calling from a delivery lot. Yejin knocked and came in. "Attorney Choi's office is calling. Procedural question about the documentation filing." "Put them through," Zuri said. She took the call. She answered the procedural question. She made 2 more calls before noon, one to Park about the Nairobi timeline, and one to a translation firm in Addis Ababa that she wanted to vet as a potential partner for the Ethiopian component of the implementation. At 12:30, she went to the building's canteen and ate lunch by herself at a table near the window. A few people from other departments looked at her with the particular quality of attention that new people attract, a mixture of curiosity and assessment, and in some cases, the faint residue of things they had read or heard that they weren't sure what to do with. She ate her food. She looked out the window. She thought about the Nairobi meeting. A young woman sat down across from her without asking. She was maybe 25, in the neat professional clothes of someone who had dressed very carefully that morning, and she was holding a tray and looking at Zuri with the specific expression of someone who has been working up to something. "I read about you," the young woman said, in Korean. Zuri looked at her. "What did you read?" "The article. From the summit." She paused. "And then the other things. After." She seemed to be choosing her words with care that was not native to the conversation. She was translating something internal before she spoke it. "I'm in the interpretation training program," she said. "First year." Zuri waited. "I wanted to ask..." Another pause. The young woman's jaw was set with the effort of continuing past the impulse to stop. How do you do it? When the room is against you and you know it, how do you keep translating accurately when... She stopped again. Zuri looked at her for a moment. This young woman in her careful clothes at the beginning of the career version of this story, asking a question that was real and not easy. "You stop translating for the room," Zuri said. "You translate for the language. The words have to mean what they mean, regardless of who's watching. The moment you start shading the translation because of the room's temperature, even in the direction of making things easier, you've lost the thing that makes you worth listening to." The young woman was quiet, processing. "It's not comfortable," Zuri said. "I'm not going to tell you it gets comfortable. You just get more precise about what the discomfort is telling you, whether it's fear or accuracy. Those are different things." The young woman nodded slowly. "Fear or accuracy," she said. "Almost always one of those two," Zuri said. The young woman stood. She seemed like she wanted to say something more and had decided not to, which Zuri respected. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name?" "Kim Soo-yeon." "Good luck in the program, Kim Soo-yeon," Zuri said. The young woman left. Zuri finished her lunch. She flew to Nairobi 6 weeks later with 3 briefing documents, a working set of the corrected implementation agreements, and a vocabulary list she'd been building for 3 weeks in a regional Kenyan administrative dialect that appeared in 2 of the infrastructure sections, and that her Swahili was close to but not exactly right for. She had a window seat. She was not a small person in an economy seat, and the window seat at least gave her a wall to lean against. She leaned against it and watched Seoul diminish below her into geometry, the grid of it, the way a city that feels overwhelming at ground level becomes a pattern from above, orderly and finite. She had been in Seoul 4 years. She had come with nothing except the language she'd accumulated in a childhood spent listening to people who spoke different things, and a graduate degree she hadn't finished, and a determination to survive in the specific, unglamorous way that survival requires. When there is no safety net, and the people who depend on you don't have one either, she had not planned for any of what had happened. She had planned to make deliveries, to keep her head down, to send money home, and to not interfere in other people's lives. She thought about what that discipline had cost, the careful smallness of it, the years of knowing what was happening in rooms and staying quiet, because staying quiet was the calculation that made sense. She thought about the specific moment she had pushed that conference room door open and the way the room had looked at her when she walked in. The particular species of invisibility that becomes visible only when it violates an expectation, not when it's there, but when it acts. She thought about Kwon Tae-young saying someone like that, and the way the room had absorbed it like weather. She thought about the fact that he had not said it because she was a delivery rider in a hotel corridor. He had said it because she was a large black woman in a delivery jacket, and those 2 facts had told him everything he needed to know about what she could and could not do, what rooms she belonged in, and what rooms she did not, and he had been so certain of that knowledge that he had said it out loud in a room full of people without the slight hesitation of someone who is afraid of being wrong. That certainty was its own kind of document with its own hidden errors. She had spent 3 days finding them. She did not feel triumphant about this. She felt mostly tired. And underneath the tired, something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite peace, but in the family of those things. The feeling of having done the specific thing that the moment required, not cleanly, not perfectly, with a back that ached and hands that had not always been steady, but done it. The plane leveled off, the city was gone. There was only the particular blue of altitude and the sound of the engines doing their work. She opened the vocabulary list on her phone and went back to studying. The Nairobi working group met for 4 days. The room was different from conference room 3C, smaller, warmer in temperature, with windows that let in a quality of light she had not seen since Zimbabwe, the specific equatorial gold of late afternoon that made everything look like it was in the middle of becoming something. She had not been back to Africa in 4 years, and the light hit her somewhere below reason, in the register where the body stores things it doesn't tell the mind about. She did her job. She navigated the transition period implementation discussion through 3 days of specific, detailed, sometimes contentious conversation between people who were building something real and felt the weight of that and wanted to get it right. She caught 2 translation problems before they became misunderstandings. She identified a cultural protocol issue in the way one party's lead negotiator expressed disagreement, an indirect form that the other party was reading as agreement, and addressed it privately with both parties during a break, which resolved in 30 minutes, something that might have taken a day to untangle in session. Advocate Wanjiku was there. On the second day, during a break, she stopped beside Zuri near the window with the equatorial light coming in and said, "You look like you belong here." Zuri looked out the window at the city moving through its afternoon. "I belong most places," she said. "That took a while to figure out." Wanjiku looked at her with the particular regard of someone who has watched a person move through fire and is now observing what they look like on the other side. "How long did it take?" Zuri considered. "About 4 days, spread across about 4 years." She paused. "And a lobby conversation I wouldn't wish on anyone." Wanjiku made a sound that was close to a laugh. "The lobby conversation is what convinced me," she said. "I had a colleague send someone down to observe. He came back and said you walked in there like you knew exactly where the floor was." "I was counting my steps," Zuri said. "That's what knowing where the floor is looks like," Wanjiku said, and moved away. On the fourth day, the working group concluded. The implementation timeline was agreed. The transition period was clear, defined identically in every language version, verified line by a process that Zuri had designed and that attorney Choi's firm had signed off on as forensically sound. The documents were signed. After the signing, Dr. Mensah found her in the corridor outside the meeting room. It was a large, careful man whose stillness she had come to understand as a form of deliberateness. He didn't move unless he meant to move, didn't speak unless he meant to speak. My consortium has an interpretation and communications position opening in the next quarter, he said. I'm not recruiting you away from your current employer. I want to be clear about that. But, she said, I wanted you to know that if you ever decide you want to build something of your own, a firm, a practice, whatever form it takes, there would be clients ready to support it from day one. He paused. You've earned that kind of offer. I don't make it lightly. She looked at him. She thought about the offer not as a destination, but as information, about what she'd built in the last 6 weeks, about what was possible, about the fact that the calculation she'd been running about her own capacity for years had been based on data she'd collected in corridors and dispatch offices and had never tested against anything larger. I'll remember that, she said. He nodded once and walked away to join his team. She called her father from Nairobi. It was Sunday evening there and early morning in Zimbabwe, which meant her father was awake because her father had never slept past 5:30 in his life, and treated the fact that other people did as a philosophical position he found mildly baffling. My daughter, he said, the way he said it, with the particular weight of a man who does not say unnecessary things, and therefore when he says something you know it carries the full freight of what he means, made her throat do something involuntary. Hi, Baba, she said. Tendai told me, he said, most of it. She tells me what she thinks I can understand and leaves out the technical parts. That's probably wise, Zuri said. You were in a big meeting, he said. Yes. And someone tried to make you look bad. Yes. And you stayed anyway. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the sounds of his farm in the background, the animals doing their early morning business, the particular quality of air that she remembered from childhood as the smell of the day before it had been used. Your grandmother used to say, he began, and then stopped, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who began sentences and left them. What did she say? Zuri asked. She said the people who tell you to be smaller are usually afraid of what they'd see if you stood up, straight. His voice was careful. He was not a man who made speeches. This was as close as he came. I don't know what they saw when you stood up in that room, but I know my daughter, and I know what she looks like when she decides something. She was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with the Nairobi evening coming through the window and the equatorial dark settling over the city outside. And she pressed the phone against her ear and said nothing for a moment because nothing was the right thing. The farm, she said finally. How is it? Recovering, he said, with a simple honesty that was its own kind of dignity. Slowly, but recovering. I'll be home in the spring, she said. I'll stay longer this time. Good, he said. And then, after a pause, eat something. You forget to eat when you're working. She laughed. It came out rougher than she expected, the laugh of someone who has been through something and finds the finding out you're still here slightly absurd. Good night, Baba, she said. Good night, my daughter. She ended the call. She sat in the hotel room with the city outside and the equatorial dark and the sound of her own breathing, which was the sound of a person who had come through something and was still here to breathe on the other side of it. She was not the same person who had stood outside that conference room door in Seoul, hearing voices in 4 languages, telling herself to walk away. That person had not disappeared. She could feel her still, in the careful habits, the reflex towards smallness, the years of keeping her head down that had become so practiced they could pass for modesty. Those years were still in her. They would always be in her. But something had been added that hadn't been there before. Not confidence in the simple sense. Something more like fluency. In herself. In the specific language of her own capacity, which she had spent 4 years refusing to speak because she couldn't afford the cost of being wrong about it. She opened her laptop. She had 3 emails that needed responses before morning, and a briefing to prepare for the follow-up call with Park on Wednesday, and a vocabulary list that wasn't finished yet. She started with the vocabulary list, because the next room was already waiting, and she intended to know every word in it before she walked through the door.